Kavrine Elowen had learned, early and painfully, that the world rewarded beautiful lies more quickly than plain truths. In the map hall of Lyras, where the salt air never entirely surrendered to stone, merchants lingered beneath vaulted ceilings to admire coastlines rendered in confident ink. They nodded at the curl of decorative waves, at the gilded cartouches that promised safety in elaborate script. They rarely asked how many nights a cartographer had spent shivering on a deck to earn the right to draw a single honest sandbar. Kavrine kept her work unadorned. Her charts held no cherubs blowing wind, no sea serpents to entertain the imagination. The lines were clean. The notes were blunt. The margins were crowded with measurements that only another practitioner would find beautiful. That morning, she was bent over her drafting table, correcting the scale of a shoal near the eastern piers for the third time, when the hall's messenger approached with a sealed packet held as if it might bite. "Kavrine Elowen?" he asked, already knowing the answer. She didn't look up until the last stroke of the quill was complete. Ink was patient, but it punished hesitation. "Yes. This is for you. From the Maritime Registry." The red wax stamp bore the registry's crest, a compass rose crowned by a narrow wave. The messenger set it down on the table as if relieved to be rid of it, then retreated. Kavrine wiped her fingers on a cloth and stared at the seal. The registry did not send letters to freelance cartographers unless there was trouble. True trouble. She broke the wax with the edge of her ruler and unfolded thick parchment that smelled faintly of rain and brine. The commission was short. It did not waste courtesy. "By authority of the Maritime Registry of Lyras, you are hereby contracted to chart and compile navigational guidance for the shifting isles, an archipelago whose present instability has resulted in the loss of vessels, cargo, and lives. Your chart must endure beyond a single sunrise. You will be granted exclusive rights and remuneration upon delivery. Failure to comply with registry oversight will be treated as obstruction." Below the text was an inked outline of a region of sea left blank, no reefs, no islands, no routes. Only a boxed notation in an unfamiliar hand, dawnshift suspected. Instruments unreliable. Sennic Varo. Kavrine read it twice, then a third time more slowly, as if the words might rearrange into something less impossible. An archipelago that moved each dawn was a sailor's ghost story. A joke told over cheap rum. Yet the registry did not pay for jokes, and it did not threaten obstruction over myths. She set the letter down, pressed her fingertips to her temple, and let herself feel the weight of it settle behind her ribs. Endure beyond a single sunrise. No map could do that if the world itself refused to stay still. She folded the parchment and slid it into her satchel. Around her, the map hall's quiet rhythm continued, the scrape of chairs, the soft mutter of negotiations, the distant gulls. For a moment she envied the men arguing over tariffs beneath a tapestry of an old, fixed coastline. Their world did not shift beneath them each morning. Their problems remained obediently where they had been placed. Kavrine rose and crossed to the hall's narrow windows. The harbor beyond was a forest of masts, ropes, and bright pennants snapping in the wind. She watched a sloop glide toward the piers, its hull painted a cheerful blue. A fisherman leaned over its rail and laughed at something shouted from shore. It looked like safety. It looked like certainty. It was, she reminded herself, an illusion earned at the cost of 1,000 small truths. Someone had charted this harbor once. Someone had marked the hidden rocks and the sand that swallowed anchors. Someone had bled a little, quietly, so that others could laugh without thinking. If the shifting isles existed, and if they were swallowing roots, then there were men and women out there who did not get to laugh. Kavrine left the map hall. She moved through Lyras with her satchel hugged tight and her mind turning like a compass needle that couldn't decide which direction was honest. The registry's offices sat near the upper docks, where warehouses met slate-roofed administration buildings and the air smelled more of ink and tar than fish. Clerks hurried across courtyards with ledgers under their arms. Marines stood at corners, hands resting on sword hilts in practiced stillness. Inside, Kavrine was ushered into a room too clean to be lived in. A man in registry grey sat behind a desk with a stack of papers aligned so precisely they might have been measured. His hair was dark and oiled. His eyes flicked over her as if calculating what sort of trouble she might become. Master Cartographer Elowen, he said, though she was no master by title. You received our commission. I did. Your acceptance will be assumed unless declined within the day. Kavrine kept her expression flat. And if I decline? The clerk smiled without warmth. Then the registry will seek someone less cautious. And more ships will vanish. It was not an answer. It was a hook. Kavrine ignored the bait and held up the letter. You want a chart that endures beyond sunrise for an archipelago that moves each dawn. That suggests your own navigators have failed. Our navigators have died, the clerk corrected, and his voice tightened briefly, a crack in the polish. The Isles have taken 7 ships since mid-autumn. Trade is already diverting. The Crown is asking questions. Insurance houses are refusing claims. He slid a smaller document across the desk, a list of vessel names and dates, each line ending with the same neat notation, lost. Kavrine scanned it and felt her mouth go dry. Ships she recognized. The Varlen Mercy, a cargo brig she had seen docked last spring. The Ellenthine, a coastal runner that carried letters and medicine. The names sat on the page like bodies laid out for identification. You've put a bounty on my success, she said softly. The clerk's gaze sharpened. We have offered you compensation commensurate with the risk. And oversight. A chart that affects the Crown cannot be created in private. Kavrine's fingers tightened around her satchel strap. Oversight meant interference. Interference meant pressure to draw what they wanted, not what was true. And this, she said, tapping the boxed notation. Sennic Varo. Who is he? The clerk hesitated just long enough to tell her the name mattered. Captain Sennic Varo. He is acquainted with the region. Why not send one of your own men to speak with him? Because he will not step into this building. The clerk's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the line where dock planks met wet stone. And because he will not be compelled. The implication hung in the air. The registry had tried. Kavrine took her papers and stood. If I accept, I choose my crew and my method. You may choose your crew, the clerk allowed. Your method will be evaluated. Kavrine smiled thinly. Then I will be evaluated at sea. She left before she said something that would make her regrettable to them. Outside, wind cut through the narrow streets. Kavrine walked until she reached the lower docks, where the harbor's noise thickened into a living thing. Sailors shouted. Nets thudded wetly onto planks. A gull swooped down to steal a scrap and was chased off with curses. She found Maritime Registry exactly where she expected, leaning against a piling, one boot propped behind her, watching the tide with a look that suggested she could scold it into obedience if it misbehaved. Mads, Kavrine called. Maritime turned, her sharp face breaking into a grin that didn't quite soften her eyes. Elowen. You look like someone offered you a fortune with teeth. Something like that. Maritime pushed off the piling. She was compact and broad-shouldered, built for hauling rope and arguing with storms. A small scar cut through her left eyebrow, pale against sun-browned skin. Kavrine held out the registry letter. Maritime read it once, then looked up slowly. The Shifting Isles. You've heard of them. I've heard sailors spit before naming them. Maritime folded the letter back up with deliberate care, as if paper could infect. Who did you anger to earn this? The registry, Kavrine said, and Maritime snorted. That's not anger, that's appetite. They want you because you don't gild your lines. Maritime's gaze sharpened. Do you intend to go? Kavrine looked past her at the sea. The harbor water was dark green, rippling with reflected masts. Beyond the breakwater, the open ocean glinted under winter sun, indifferent and wide. Yes, Kavrine said, because the names on the lost list would not let her say anything else. But not with their man breathing down my neck on deck. Maritime's grin returned, quick and fierce. Good. Because if a registry envoy tries to tell me how to set sail, I'll toss him in the bilge. You'll come, then. Someone has to make sure you don't get yourself drowned for the sake of a clean margin. Maritime tucked the letter into Kavrine's satchel and nodded toward the far pier. You still have access to the Velwood. Kavrine's ship sat moored at the end of the docks like a patient creature waiting to be tasked. The Velwood was not large, sturdy, fast enough, with a hull designed for shallow approaches and quick turns. It had carried Kavrine along dangerous coasts before, held steady through squalls and fog. It had earned her trust. "The Velwood will do," Kavrine said. "We'll need a tide watcher." Madrine's eyes narrowed. "Rel. He listens," Kavrine said. "And he keeps his fear from infecting his hands." Madrine huffed, but it was agreement. "I'll fetch him." "You." "I have to find Sennic Varo." Madrine's face shifted, something like warning sliding under the surface. "That one. You know him too." "I've seen his ship anchored just outside the tide line like a dog tied to a post." Madrine crossed her arms. "They say he can't step on land." "So the clerk implied." Madrine's gaze flicked toward the point where the docks curved out toward open water. "If you're going to bargain with him, take care. Curses don't make men honest. Sometimes they make them desperate." Kavrine held Madrine's gaze. "I don't bargain with desperation. I bargain with truth." Madrine's mouth twitched. "Then I'll pray your truth floats." They parted, Madrine striding off toward the inner docks and the sailors' haunts where Rel Orsane could be found, and Kavrine heading toward the harbor mouth. Sennic Varo's ship was easy to identify. It sat anchored just beyond the last pier, where the water deepened and the harbor's protection began to thin. The vessel was a two-masted brigantine with a blackened hull that looked less painted than weathered into darkness. Its name was carved into the stern in narrow letters, Sableward. Kavrine hired a small skiff and a reluctant boy to row her out. The boy kept his eyes fixed on the oars and his mouth tight. "You've been out here before," Kavrine observed. "Once," the boy muttered. "Never again." "What happened?" He swallowed. "Nothing. That's the trouble. Nothing happened and I still can't sleep when the tide changes." Kavrine didn't press. Fear didn't need encouragement. As they approached the brigantine, a rope ladder dropped down without anyone visible at the rail. A voice called from above, low, rough, carrying the sea in it. "Stop there." The boy froze mid-stroke. Kavrine stood in the skiff carefully and looked up. A man leaned over the rail, watching them with eyes the color of storm glass. His hair was dark and wind-tangled, tied back with a strip of faded cloth. He had the worn posture of someone who lived with shifting decks under his feet. Even still, he held himself as if he expected to be struck. "You're Captain Varo," Kavrine said. "And you are the registry's newest tool," he replied, not unkindly, but without courtesy. Kavrine felt the boy glance at her as if begging her to deny it. "I'm Kavrine Elowen," she said. "A cartographer. I'm not owned." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, quick and gone. "Cartographers are always owned. If not by patrons, then by their own pride." Kavrine kept her voice even. "I was told you know the shifting isles." "I know enough to keep myself alive," he said. "That's not the same as knowing." "I'm not looking for myth," Kavrine said. "I'm looking for patterns." His gaze sharpened, as if he could taste the difference between those words and the ones he was used to hearing. "Patterns are another kind of myth." Kavrine lifted her chin. "If you won't speak here, tell me where." He laughed once, short and dry. "Where do you think?" "I can't go to you." That was confirmation, sharp as salt. Kavrine glanced toward the harbor, toward the fixed planks and stone and crowds. It would be easy to walk away and decide she could do without him. It would also be a lie. The shifting isles were taking ships, she needed every scrap of knowledge. "Then let me come aboard," she said. His eyes flicked to the boy in the skiff. "Send him back." The boy didn't wait for Kavrine's permission. He thrust the oars into the water as if they were weapons and began rowing with frantic relief. Kavrine watched him go, then looked up again. "Now!" The ladder swayed gently, an invitation and a challenge. Kavrine climbed. The deck of the Sableward smelled of tar and salt, of rope and damp wood. The crew moved with quiet efficiency, but they watched her with careful eyes, men who had seen too much and trusted too little. No one spoke as she stepped onto the planks. Sennic Varo descended the steps from the quarterdeck with measured ease. Up close, Kavrine saw the fine cracks along his knuckles, pale lines like old scars, and the faint crusting at the edge of his boots where salt had dried. He stopped an arm's length away, as if distance was habit. So, the registry sent you. They hired me, Kavrine corrected. To do what their men couldn't, he said. To pin the sea down. I can't pin the sea down, Kavrine replied. But I can listen and record. Sennic's gaze held hers, searching for something. Cynicism, perhaps. Greed. The bright-eyed hunger of someone who wanted to be the first to tame a mystery. If he found those things in her, he didn't show it. What do you want from me? Kavrine asked. He exhaled slowly. I want you to understand what you are walking into. I already understand it's dangerous. No, his voice sharpened, and the crew stilled subtly around them, as if he had spoken a word that mattered. Danger is a storm. A reef. A mutiny. This is different. Kavrine waited. Sennic motioned toward the harbor, toward the line where sea met stone. You see land as safety. I see it as fixed, Kavrine said. Fixed isn't always safe. A flicker of approval crossed his face. I can't step there, he said quietly. Not without paying. Kavrine's eyes dropped to his boots. The salt crusting was more than dried sea spray. It clung too thickly, too insistently, as if it belonged to him. You're cursed. Sennic's jaw tightened. Yes. By what? The Isles, he said, and his voice held no superstition, only grim certainty. Or whatever rules them. The tide writ. Call it what you like. Kavrine filed the name away. Why? He looked away, out toward open water. Because I tried to make them mine. It was a confession offered without flourish, and it landed with a weight Kavrine could feel. Do you regret it? She asked. Sennic's eyes returned to hers, steady and bleak. Every day. Regret doesn't undo consequences. No, Kavrine thought. It didn't. But it could shape what a person chose next. What do you want now? She asked again. Sennic's fingers flexed once, as if the joints ached. I want you to draw what is true. Not what the registry wants. Not what sailors want to believe. What is? If you draw the Isles as a thing to be conquered, they will kill you. And they will kill everyone who follows your ink. Kavrine's throat tightened. And if I draw them as they are, they might let you pass, he said. They might even settle enough for you to measure. But you will have to accept that some things cannot be made permanent. The commission demanded permanence. Kavrine felt the conflict like a pulled thread. I can't promise permanence, she said slowly. But I can promise honesty. Sennic studied her, as if weighing the cost of trusting her with anything. Honesty, he repeated, and the word sounded unfamiliar on his tongue. Very well. I will guide you, Kavrine Elowen. But not for coin. Kavrine kept her posture calm. Then for what? For a vow, he said. Kavrine's stomach tightened. I don't make vows lightly. Good, Sennic replied. Neither do I anymore. He stepped closer, just enough that she could see the pale salt dust at the edge of his lashes. Vow that you will not sell the Isles into certainty. Vow that you will not sign your map like a claim. Kavrine held his gaze. I haven't even seen the Isles. That's why the vow matters, he said. Before you are tempted. Before the registry offers you a crown's worth of gold and calls it duty. Kavrine's fingers curled around the strap of her satchel. She disliked vows because they were not measurements. They were not controlled. They depended on a future self who might be frightened or hungry or lonely enough to break them. But she also knew that refusing would cost her this guide, and perhaps cost sailors their lives. Kavrine drew a slow breath. I vow this. I will not draw lies to make the shifting Isles a weapon. I will not sign my work as ownership. If I chart anything, it will be to guide passage and prevent death. Sennic's gaze didn't soften, but something in his shoulders eased, a fraction of tension releasing as if he had been holding his breath for years. Say it again, he murmured. Kavrine's brows knit. You don't trust my first vow? I don't trust anything, he said simply. Then, quieter, but I want to. The honesty of that raw and unadorned caught Kavrine off guard. She repeated the vow, steady and clear. When she finished, the wind shifted. It was subtle enough that another person might not notice, But Kavrine had lived long enough with sails overhead to feel when the air decided to move differently. A coolness slid across the deck, carrying the faint scent of rain that wasn't in the harbor. The crew glanced around, uneasy. Sennic's eyes narrowed, and he looked toward the horizon where open sea met sky. "You felt that?" "I did," Kavrine said, and her pulse quickened. "Was that the Isles? Or the rules that govern them?" Sennic replied. He turned back to her. "If you're coming, you come soon. Dawn doesn't wait for anyone's preparations." "I have a ship," Kavrine said. "The Velwood." "A crew." "Bring only those you trust," Sennic said, and the words held a warning carved from experience. "Fear spreads faster than fire at sea." Kavrine nodded. "We sail by night." "Good," Sennic said. Then, as if it cost him, "Be careful who you let aboard your purpose. The registry's reach is long." Kavrine's mouth tightened. "They'll want oversight. They'll want control." "And you?" Kavrine asked. Sennic's eyes met hers again. "I want you alive." It was said like a fact, not a flirtation. It landed with unexpected warmth anyway, a small flare against the chill of the commission. Kavrine found she didn't have an answer that felt safe to speak. She left the Sable Ward with the same skiff, this time rowed by one of Sennic's men who did not look as frightened but did not look pleased either. As she stepped back onto the dock, she watched Sennic remain on his deck, the harbor line between them like a boundary drawn in salt. Back at the Velwood, Maritime was already making arrangements. Barrels of fresh water were being hoisted aboard. Coils of rope lay stacked and ready. Rel Orsane stood near the gangplank clutching a weathered notebook, his eyes too wide and his lips pressed tight as if to hold himself together by force. "You're coming," Kavrine said to him. Rel swallowed. "Maritime said you'd pay double." "I'll pay you what keeps you honest," Kavrine replied. "I need your eyes and your notes. Not your bravery. The sea will take care of testing the rest." Rel nodded quickly, grateful for the permission not to pretend. Maritime approached, hands on hips. "So, did you find your cursed captain?" "I did," Kavrine said. "He'll guide us." Maritime brows rose. "Just like that?" "He asked for a vow," Kavrine admitted. Maritime expression tightened. "And you gave it?" Kavrine held her gaze. "I gave the vow I intended to keep." Maritime studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "All right. Then we keep it." The crew that night was small: Maritime, Rel, 2 deckhands who had sailed with Kavrine before, Nething and Jorv, and a cook who knew how to make hardtack taste less like sorrow. No registry men. No armed protection. Kavrine didn't announce her departure at the registry offices, because she had learned that permission was another word for leash. They cast off at sunset. The harbor's lights dwindled behind them, lanterns becoming scattered stars along the shore. The Velwood cut through dark water with a quiet confidence that soothed Kavrine's nerves. She stood at the stern and watched Lyras fall away, feeling the familiar mix of exhilaration and dread that came with leaving fixed things behind. Maritime took the first watch and kept the crew busy, because idle hands invented fear. Rel sat near the mast with his notebook open, recording wind direction and wave height with frantic precision. Kavrine spread her blank vellum on a protected table below deck and checked her instruments again and again, the star glass, the tidestake weights, the ink she had treated to resist damp. Above deck, the sea smelled sharper the farther they traveled, as if they were moving into water that hadn't yet learned the habits of shore. Near midnight, a dark shape appeared off their port side, the Sable Ward. It sailed parallel, close enough that Kavrine could see the faint glow of lanterns along its rail. It moved like a shadow that knew where it was going even when the world shifted. Kavrine climbed to the deck and watched it. Sennic stood at his quarterdeck, hands resting on the rail. He didn't call out. He didn't wave. He simply held position, guiding without needing to perform it. Kavrine found herself matching his distance unconsciously, as if they were both testing the line between reliance and surrender. The night deepened. By the hour before dawn, the sea had changed. The waves grew oddly smooth, as if the water was holding its breath. The air cooled. The stars sharpened into hard points. Even the Velwood's creak seemed muted, the ship quieting as if sensing a predator. Rel climbed to the bow and called softly, "There." Kavrine followed his pointing finger. At first, she saw nothing, only darkness. Then the horizon ahead seemed to ripple, as if the sea itself had become glass and someone had stirred a hand through it. A faint line rose from the water, pale as bone. Stone. An island, lifting its spine above the waves. And then another, to the right. And another, farther back, like a chain of teeth surfacing to bite the sky. The shifting isles. They were not lush green jewels. They were low, jagged, ringed with reefs that glimmered faintly as if lit from within. The water around them was a different color, deeper, almost black, as if the sea there held a secret. Kavrine's breath caught. Wonder tried to bloom, but it was strangled by something colder, the sense that she was looking at a place that did not care if she lived. Maritime came up beside her, silent. Even she had no jest ready. The sable ward angled closer, cutting a path through water that seemed to thicken as they approached. Sennic's voice carried across the gap, low and clear. "Do not anchor." Maritime cupped her hands to shout back. "We weren't planning to." "Good," Sennic called. "Anchor chains make promises. The Isles dislike promises that aren't kept." Kavrine felt a chill crawl up her spine. She opened her mouth to ask what he meant, but the sky began to pale at the edge, thin light bleeding upward. "Dawn." Rel's voice trembled. "It's moving." Kavrine looked again, and the islands, those jagged spines, were sliding. Not with waves, not with tide, but with a slow, deliberate glide, as if the sea beneath them had become a moving floor. The reef line shifted sideways, the very shape of the archipelago altering as the first sunlight touched the water. Kavrine's stomach lurched. Her mind reached for measurements, for angles, for anything that could be recorded and made sane. "Dawn stakes," she snapped. Nething and Jorv moved instantly, hauling the weighted floats to the rail. Kavrine took one herself and threw it overboard, watching it splash and settle, the line unspooling, weight sinking into the dark. The float bobbed obediently at first. Then the sea tugged. The float slid sideways as if caught in a current that wasn't there a moment ago. Kavrine marked the angle. Rel scribbled furiously. The islands continued their slow, terrible glide. From somewhere ahead, a cry carried over the water. It was not a gull. It was human. Maritime stiffened. "Did you hear that?" Kavrine's heart kicked. "Yes." Sennic's ship altered course without hesitation, veering toward the sound. Kavrine didn't think. She followed. As they drew closer, the sea grew more chaotic, currents twisting around hidden reefs. Foam rose in sudden lines. The air smelled of crushed stone and salt so sharp it stung. And then Kavrine saw it, a small skiff, wedged against a reef that had lifted in the dawn shift. Its hull was cracked, one side canted dangerously. Two figures clung to it, one adult, one smaller, perhaps a child. They were soaked, shivering, their faces pale with terror. The reef around them was not stable. It was moving, grinding against the skiff with slow cruelty as the islands repositioned. Maritime swore under her breath. "We can't get close without scraping our hull." "We don't have time," Rel whispered, eyes wide. "The reef." Kavrine's mind flashed to the list of lost ships, to names reduced to neat ink. "We can," she said, forcing her voice steady. "We go in under oar. We use the skiff." Maritime gaze snapped to hers. "Kavrine." "We go now," Kavrine repeated, and she heard her own vow echoing in her ribs, guide passage and prevent death. Maritime's jaw clenched. Then she nodded sharply, the decision made. "Jorv." "Nothing." "With me." "Rel, you stay aboard and keep notes. If the Isles shift again, I want bearings." Rel swallowed hard and nodded. Kavrine grabbed a coil of rope and a buoyancy sling. Her hands were steady, even though her stomach felt hollow. They lowered the velwood skiff into the water and climbed in, oars biting into the dark. The current tried to twist them sideways, but Maritime fought it with practiced strength, her muscles straining. Kavrine matched her stroke, eyes fixed on the stranded skiff. The closer they came, the more the reef seemed alive, stone rising and sinking in slow pulses, water boiling around it. The adult on the stranded skiff saw them and sobbed, the sound raw. The child clung tighter, face buried in the adult's shoulder. "Hold on," Mayrine shouted. "Don't move." Kavrine's skiff bumped hard against a smaller outcropping. She grabbed the rope and threw it, aiming for the skiff's stern. The rope caught, snagging on a broken cleat. Jorv secured it around their own skiff's post. Nething leaned forward, ready with the sling. Kavrine met the adult's eyes. A man, older than she first thought, his face lined with salt and exhaustion. His lips were blue. "Can you stand?" Kavrine called. He shook his head weakly. "My leg." "We'll lift you," Kavrine said. "Listen to my voice. When I tell you, you hold the child tight and let us pull." The man nodded, trembling. Behind them, the sable ward hovered at a distance it dared not breach. Sennic stood at the rail like a dark sentinel. Kavrine didn't have time to wonder what he felt watching others touch land and stone while he could not. "Now!" Mayrine shouted. Kavrine and Nething hauled together, the rope burning against their palms. The stranded skiff scraped, shuddered, and slid free a fraction. Another pull, and it lurched into deeper water. The reef shifted again. Stone ground against wood with a groan that made Kavrine's teeth ache. "Hurry!" Kavrine cried. They pulled hard, dragging the skiff off the reef's teeth. Water flooded its cracked hull, but it floated long enough. Mayrine brought their skiff alongside. Nething reached out, hooking the sling beneath the injured man's arms while Kavrine steadied the child, hands gentle but firm. The child's eyes met hers, wide, terrified, too old for such fear. Kavrine swallowed and kept her voice calm. "You're safe. I've got you." She lifted the child into their skiff, feeling how light the body was, how cold. The injured man groaned as they hauled him, but he didn't fight. He clung to the sling and let them lift him free of the doomed skiff. As soon as his weight settled into their boat, the abandoned skiff gave a final shudder and cracked in half, swallowed by the reef's shifting mouth. Kavrine's breath caught. If they had been moments later. Mayrine didn't let her finish the thought. "Row," she barked. They pulled away hard, oars digging into water that fought them. The current seized their skiff and tried to spin it toward a jagged line of reef rising ahead, but Mayrine countered, muscles straining, face set in grim focus. Kavrine clutched the child close, shielding the small body from spray. The injured man sagged, eyes half-lidded, lips moving as if in prayer. Behind them, the dawn light climbed higher, and the islands continued to slide. The world, it seemed, would rearrange itself whether they survived or not. Kavrine tightened her hold and stared at the shifting horizon, ink and fear and vow all tangled together inside her. And somewhere beyond the churn of reefs and currents, Sennic Varo's dark ship held steady, watching, waiting as if the sea itself had paused to see what kind of truth she would choose next. The child slept in fits, waking with small gasps that turned into shivers if Kavrine loosened her hold. Kavrine kept her wrapped in a spare cloak below deck, where the lantern light was warm and steady and the sound of waves felt less like a threat. The injured man, Ferris, he managed to whisper between clenched teeth, had a leg pinned when the reef lifted under his skiff. Mayrine set the bone as gently as hands like hers could manage, then bound it tight with splints cut from an old crate. Ferris didn't cry out. He only stared at the ceiling as if he was memorizing the shape of safety so he could carry it back to shore. Kavrine heard him murmur the same sentence more than once when he thought no one listened. It moved. It moved while the sun rose. Each time he said it, his voice thinned, like something inside him was being pulled taut. By full daylight, the immediate crisis was over, but the sea did not relax. Around the shifting isles, water never behaved as mere water. It held a tension that made every rope seem too fragile, every plank too thin. Kavrine stood at the small table where her vellum was weighted at the corners. A film of damp clung to everything. She had already learned to keep her ink stoppered with wax and her quills wrapped in oiled cloth. She made notes in the margins with a hardness that felt almost like anger, at the Isles, at the registry, at herself for doubting their existence. Rel sat opposite her, his notebook open, fingers stained with graphite. His eyes flicked constantly to the narrow porthole where a sliver of sea showed through. As if he expected the water to change color mid-blink. "It's wrong," he said, voice thin. "The stars last night, my bearings didn't match any chart." "They weren't supposed to," Kavrine replied without looking up. The isles shift. Their reefs shift. That changes currents, which changes drift. The sky didn't move. We did. Rel swallowed. But it felt like the sky moved. Kavrine paused, quill hovering. That was the trouble. A thing didn't need to be true to be persuasive. She forced her attention back to paper. Record what you felt. Separate it from what you measured. Rel nodded, grateful for instruction. He wrote furiously. Above deck, Madrine's voice carried on the wind, sharp and steady. She kept the crew busy with tasks that required hands and focus, cleaning lines, checking lashings, recorking a seam that had begun to weep. Fear had less room to grow when work filled the air. Kavrine climbed the steps and emerged into pale sun. The shifting isles sat to the east now, closer than before, their outlines changed. Where last dawn had shown a long jagged spine, now there were 3 low islands like broken teeth and a reef ring that glittered as if lit from beneath. The sea around them was darker, almost black, and it pulled at the surface in slow, spiraling motions. The sable ward sailed near but not alongside, keeping a distance that felt intentional. Sennic stood at his quarterdeck, gaze fixed on the islands as if he was watching a living thing breathe. Kavrine crossed to the rail, fingers curling around damp wood. The air tasted faintly of iron. Is it always this close? She called across the water. Sennic's head turned. His eyes found her with unsettling ease. Close is relative, he answered. The isles decide what distance means. That isn't helpful. It's honest, he replied. Kavrine bit back a retort and tried again. The reef patterns, do they follow a sequence? A cycle? Sennic leaned his forearms on the rail. Yes. But it isn't a clockwork cycle. It's a tide of choices. Kavrine frowned. Explain. He hesitated, then said, when ships come with greed, the water becomes teeth. When ships come with fear, it becomes fog. When ships come with respect, he glanced at the velward skiff, now empty, hanging from its davits. Sometimes it becomes a path. Madrine, overhearing, snorted. So all we have to do is be respectful and the sea will behave. Sennic's gaze flicked to her. No. You have to be truthful. Respect is easy to mimic. Truth costs. Kavrine felt the words settle uncomfortably in her chest. Truth costs. That was the first rule of her work, but she had never heard it spoken like a warning. She turned away from the islands and walked toward the stern, where the wind was calmer. Why did the reef lift under that man's skiff? She asked, softer now. Sennic's voice carried after her. Because he anchored. Kavrine froze. She looked back. He didn't mention anchoring. Men don't confess to the sea, Sennic said. They confess to land. He dropped chain because he thought it would hold. The isles dislike chains. Kavrine's gaze sharpened. You said anchor chains make promises. They do, Sennic replied. A promise to stay. A claim of certainty. The tide writ hears it. Kavrine turned that over in her mind, trying to translate metaphor into mechanism. Promise. Claim. Here. Magic, then. Not superstition. A system. She had to know its rules, or she would die inside them. That afternoon, with Ferris's fever easing and the child tamer no longer shaking at every creak, Kavrine began her work in earnest. She did not attempt to draw the island's positions as fixed points. Instead, she sketched fields, zones of behavior. She drew arrows that represented currents as they had been at dawn and at full light. She marked where reefs rose like a mouth and where water smoothed into deceptive calm. She left blank spaces where instruments had stuttered. She sent Madrine and Jorv out in the skiff to set the first dawn stakes at a respectful distance from the reef ring. They dropped weighted lines with floats that would drift and show the sea's pull. Kavrine instructed them not to tie anything to stone. No knots on land. No chains. No claims. By late evening, the stakes had shifted in ways that made her brow tighten. Their drift was not random. They traced arcs that resembled handwriting, looping and curling back as if the water was drawing its own map. Rel leaned over her shoulder. It looks like letters. It looks like patterns, Kavrine corrected, but she couldn't deny the unsettling resemblance. The The sea did not merely move, it described. As twilight deepened, Sennic rowed a small boat over. He did not step onto the dock planks of the Velwood's deck extension. He caught a rope tossed from Madrine and kept himself anchored in water beside the hull. The simple act made Madrine's mouth tighten. It felt like watching a man stand at a door he wasn't allowed to enter. Sennic looked up at Kavrine from the rocking boat. "Your rescued man," he said. "Will you take him back?" Kavrine nodded. "When he's stable enough. We'll pass the outer shoals on the way. There's a lighthouse there, Soria Loom keeps it. She'll have medicine." Sennic's gaze sharpened. "You know of Soria?" "I charted the coast near her light 2 years ago," Kavrine said. "She pays in tea and blunt advice." Sennic's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Then listen to her advice." "I always do," Kavrine lied, and Madrine made an amused sound behind her. Sennic's eyes moved to the vellum under Kavrine's hand. "You aren't drawing their shape." "I can't," Kavrine replied. "Not if it changes. The registry hired you to draw certainty. The registry doesn't get to decide what reality is," Kavrine said, sharper than she intended. For a moment, the wind seemed to pause again, as it had when she'd spoken her vow on the Sablewood's deck. Kavrine felt it like a pressure in her ears. Sennic studied her. "Good." Kavrine didn't like the approval more than she liked earning it. She gestured toward her draft. "What do you know of the tide writ? Tell me plainly." Sennic's jaw flexed. "Plainly? It's a law of the Isles. A pattern that punishes being named like property. That's still metaphor." His gaze held hers. "Because plain language makes people think they understand. And then they die." Kavrine forced herself to breathe slowly. "Try anyway." Sennic's fingers tightened on the rope he held. The rope was wet. His knuckles were cracked, and salt clung to the lines like dried frost. "The Isles move at dawn because dawn is a boundary," he said. "Night becomes day. Water becomes light. Everything that tries to be fixed is forced to remember it isn't." Kavrine's mind caught on that. Boundary. Transition. That could be measured, in a way. "And the curse?" she asked quietly. Sennic's eyes darkened. "That is what happens when you break a vow made to them." "You made a vow," Kavrine said. It wasn't a question. He held her gaze and did not deny it. "I promised I would not sell their roots into certainty." "And you did?" "Yes." The word was heavy. The boat rocked gently against the hull. The sea lapped like a tongue testing wood. Kavrine's chest tightened. "Then why help me? Why not let the Isles take the registry's ships as they deserve?" Sennic's voice went rough. "Because sailors aren't the registry. Tamer wasn't the registry." His gaze flicked briefly toward the cabin where the child slept. "And because I don't want my mistake to keep killing people." Kavrine watched him, searching for falsehood. She had learned how easily men shaped truth to fit their needs. But Sennic's honesty had an ugly edge that didn't flatter him. That was harder to fake. "Then teach me," Kavrine said. "Not in riddles." Sennic exhaled. "All right. Here is one rule: never name a path as if it belongs to you. Never mark a route like a road. The Isles will unmake it. If you must chart behavior. Chart what the sea does when people act with certain intent." Intent. Kavrine tasted the word and disliked it because it wasn't measurable with a ruler. And yet it was shaping reefs. "How does the tide writ know intent?" she asked. Sennic's eyes lifted to the horizon, where the last strip of sun bled into water. "Because the sea touches everyone. It hears your hands in the rope. It hears your breath when you say you're owed. It hears the difference between rescue and possession." Kavrine stared at him. A part of her wanted to dismiss it as poetry. A deeper part of her, older, sharper, recognized that poetry was sometimes how truth survived when numbers failed. Madrine cut in, voice skeptical. "So what? If we think polite thoughts, the Isles let us through?" Sennic looked at her, unimpressed. "No. If you make yourselves a lie, the Isles will answer with teeth." Madrine's mouth tightened. "Good. I hate having to pretend." Kavrine hid a small smile. When Sennic left that evening, rowing back to his ship without stepping onto the Velwood's planks, Kavrine returned below deck and stared at her vellum for a long time. She had been hired to create a weapon, whether the registry admitted it or not. A lasting route through the Isles would give the Crown leverage, taxes, patrols, monopoly. It would also save lives. The problem was that the Isles themselves might decide those were not separate outcomes. Kavrine dipped her quill and wrote in the margin of her draft, "Do not draw roads. Draw rules." Then, beneath it, because she had learned that vows could slip if not anchored, passage, rescue, respect. In the quiet hours before sleep, she checked on Tamer. The child's lashes lay dark against hollow cheeks. Kavrine adjusted the cloak, then stilled when Tamer's eyes fluttered open. Tamer stared at her, unblinking. "Are we going to die?" the child whispered. Kavrine's throat tightened. She didn't lie to children. She didn't lie to anyone, not if she could help it. "We're going to do everything we can not to," she said. Tamer's lower lip trembled. The water was mad. Kavrine brushed a stray curl away from the child's forehead. The hair was damp and smelled of smoke and salt. "It was frightened," Kavrine said softly, surprising herself. "Water can't be frightened." Kavrine thought of Sennic's words. "It hears your breath when you say you're owed." "It can," she said. "When people treat it like a thing they own." Tamer's eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to understand. "Did my father treat it like that?" Kavrine's hand stilled. Ferris had anchored. Anchors made promises. "I don't know," Kavrine said carefully. "But I know he loves you. And love doesn't own. Love holds." Tamer blinked, and the tension in the small body eased a fraction. The child's eyes drifted shut again. Kavrine stayed until Tamer's breathing evened, then returned to the main cabin. She did not sleep quickly. Outside, the sea made its low, constant sound against the hull, a whisper that felt like writing. Before dawn, she woke to the sensation of wrongness. Not a noise. Not a movement. A shift in pressure, like a held breath released. Kavrine threw on her coat and climbed to the deck. The sky was still dark, but the horizon carried a thin, pale seam of approaching light. The Isles were visible as darker shapes against darker water, their edges blurred. Mayrine stood at the rail, already awake, eyes narrowed. "You felt it too," she said. Kavrine nodded. Rel stumbled up behind them, hair sticking up, notebook clutched like a lifeline. "The stakes," he gasped. "The stakes are moving backwards." Kavrine's gaze snapped to the floats they had set. In the lantern glow, she could see them, small pale dots on the water, sliding, against the expected drift, as if pulled by an unseen hand. Sennic's ship shifted position as well, sails tightening. He called across the water, voice urgent. Someone named it. Kavrine's blood went cold. "Named what?" "The route," Sennic shouted. Someone spoke a claim at the edge of dawn. As if in answer, the sea ahead churned. The smooth black water broke into pale foam, and a line of reef rose where none had been, stone teeth lifting to block the open channel. Mayrine swore. "We didn't anchor. We didn't tie. We didn't." "It wasn't you," Sennic called. "But you are near enough to be punished by association." Kavrine's stomach lurched. Association. Proximity. Collateral consequence. A shape appeared in the dim light, a cutter, sleek and fast, approaching from the harbor direction. Its lanterns were hooded. Its sails were dark. Registry. Kavrine's hand tightened on the rail until her knuckles ached. She could feel the Isles reacting, tightening like a fist. The registry had followed her. And dawn was coming. Kavrine's mind raced, already mapping cause and consequence. If the registry's presence provoked the tidewrit, then her expedition was not only a survey, it was a test of intent, and they had just brought the wrong kind of intent to the edge of sunrise. She turned to Mayrine, voice low and sharp. "Get everyone awake. Secure anything loose. We're going to need speed." Mayrine didn't argue. Her eyes gleamed with anger that had found a target. "With pleasure." Kavrine looked again toward the thin line of light on the horizon and felt the weight of her vow settle into her bones. The Isles would move. The sea would write. And now, someone else had put their hand to the page. The registry cutter came on like a blade, slicing the dark water with practiced certainty. It was smaller than the Velwood and the Sableward, built for speed and authority rather than endurance, its hull painted a disciplined grey that vanished against pre-dawn sea. A lantern at its bow flashed twice, an unmistakable signal. Mayrine spat over the rail. They're not even pretending it's a coincidence. Kavrine's eyes stayed on the rising reef line ahead, stone teeth lifting as the sky began to pale. They brought intent, she said, voice tight. And the Isles answered. Rel clutched his notebook with white fingers. Captain, Kavrine, if the channel closes, we can't. We will, Mayrine snapped, because anger was easier than panic. We will because I refuse to die near a harbour rat in a fancy coat. From the Sableward, Sennic's voice carried across the gap, urgent and unsoftened. Do not run straight. Mayrine leaned out. What else do we do? Invite them aboard for tea? Angle, Sennic called. Let them chase. Don't lead them into a line. Kavrine understood instantly. If Pell wanted a sure route, he would drive toward the most obvious opening. If she fled into that opening, she would make it a road. The Isles would punish the claim by closing it and take everyone in the bargain. She turned to Mayrine. Hard to starboard. We follow the drift of the stakes. Mayrine's eyebrows jumped. You want to steer by floating bits of rope. Kavrine's jaw set. The tide writ is already writing. We read what it allows. Mayrine grinned like a woman given permission to be reckless in a controlled way. Aye. The Velwood swung, its hull leaning as the wind caught. The sea tugged at the keel with disorienting force, pulling the ship sideways toward darker water, away from the obvious channel and closer to a glassy stretch that looked calm in a way that made Kavrine's skin prickle. Behind them, the cutter adjusted course, relentless. Rel scrambled to the rail and shouted, voice cracking, they're matching us. Let them, Kavrine said. She kept her eyes on the dawn stakes, the floats sliding in arcs that were not random. They drifted along a curve that bowed gently away from the rising reef teeth, like a pen stroke avoiding a blot. The first strip of sunlight broke over the horizon. The Isles moved. It was never less unsettling. Stone shifted through water with a smoothness that felt wrong, islands gliding as if the sea was solid beneath them. The reef ring that had gleamed faintly yesterday lifted higher now, its submerged points surfacing to form new barriers. The safe channel the Registry cutter aimed for narrowed in a heartbeat. The cutter surged anyway. For a moment it seemed it would slip through, its bow just clearing the forming teeth until the water beneath it changed. Not a wave. Not a swell. A pull. The cutter's stern swung as if caught by an unseen hand, dragging it sideways. Men shouted. A horn blared. Oars splashed down too late, frantic. Then the reef rose like a verdict. The cutter scraped hard, wood against stone, and a shudder went through its frame. The sound carried across the water an ugly, expensive groan. Kavrine's breath caught. Even from this distance, she could see splinters fly. Mayrine's face was fierce with grim satisfaction. That's what happens when you think the world owes you a road. Sennic's voice came again, sharp. Don't gloat. The Isles don't distinguish between your smile and their claim. Kavrine swallowed and forced her gaze away from the cutter's flailing. She kept the Velwood aligned with the stakes drift, reading the sea's handwriting as if it were a language she had always known but never been taught. They slipped past the worst of the new reef line. The water stayed dark and unnervingly smooth, but it did not bite. Behind them, the cutter remained trapped, men struggling to push it free while the Isles continued their slow dawn rearrangement. Kavrine did not let herself feel triumph. She let herself feel responsibility. Mark this, she told Rel. Not the position. The behavior. The cutter approached in certainty, straight line, named intent. Reef rose. Current grabbed. Teeth formed. Rel nodded, scribbling so hard the graphite snapped. He didn't notice. He kept writing with the broken piece anyway. By late morning, the Velwood and Sableward had put more distance between themselves and the trapped cutter, keeping to waters that shifted but did not rage. The Isles' silhouettes changed behind them, the archipelago reshaping like a thought reconsidering itself. Kavrine's hands still trembled faintly when she returned below deck to her vellum. She steadied them by setting her ruler down with precise care. Precision was how she made fear smaller. Mayrine came down a moment later, damp hair tied back, cheeks flushed with cold wind. They'll get free eventually, she said, as if Pell's survival was an irritation. But they'll think twice. Kavrine glanced up. Men like Pell don't think twice, she said. They think harder. Mayrine's eyes narrowed. So what now? We go deeper before he can catch up. We go smarter, Kavrine replied. She gestured to the vellum. We chart rules. We chart what provokes backlash. We make a map that can't be used like a leash. Mayrine stared at the page, lips pursed. A map that refuses to be a map. Kavrine's mouth tightened. A map that tells the truth. That afternoon, they sailed toward the outer shoals to bring Ferris and Tamer to the lighthouse. The sea felt less hostile away from the heart of the Isles, though it still held an anxious restlessness as if the tide-writ had been stirred by the registry's intrusion and had not settled again. The lighthouse appeared at dusk, a pale stone tower rising from a low cliff like a finger pointing at the sky. Its lamp was already lit, a steady golden eye that cut through the haze. As they approached the small dock, Kavrine saw a woman waiting at the edge of the stone, wrapped in a heavy coat, her hair braided tight against the wind. She didn't wave. She simply watched with the calm of someone who had seen ships come in broken and still expected them to dock properly. Soria loom, Kavrine called as they drew near. Soria's gaze flicked over the velwood, noting the hurried repairs, the salt crust on the lines, the way the crew moved like people who had been tested. Her eyes landed on Kavrine with disarming directness. You smell like trouble, she said. Kavrine exhaled, almost laughing despite herself. Hello to you too. Soria's mouth twitched. Bring your injured and you're frightened. And don't drip on my steps like you're paying for the privilege. Mayrine muttered, I like her. They carried Ferris carefully onto the dock, Tamer clinging to Kavrine's sleeve. Soria guided them inside without fuss, her lighthouse interior warm with the scent of dried herbs and oil. She examined Ferris's leg with brisk competence and nodded approval at Mayrine's splinting. Not bad, she said, which from Soria sounded like praise. Ferris's eyes filled when Tamer was given a mug of broth and a blanket. Thank you, he rasped, voice cracking. Soria waved the gratitude away like smoke. Thank the woman who dragged you out of a reef's mouth. And don't anchor near the shifting isles again unless you want to become a lesson. Ferris flinched, shame flashing across his face. He looked at Kavrine, mouth opening as if to confess. Kavrine cut him off gently. You're alive, she said. That matters more than your pride. Soria's gaze sharpened. Alive is the beginning, not the ending. Kavrine turned toward her. You've heard more than rumors, then. Soria poured tea into a chipped cup and slid it across the table. I live on the edge of a sea that punishes arrogance. I hear plenty. Kavrine took the cup, warmth seeping into her fingers. The registry is trying to claim a lasting route. Soria snorted. They always do. Someone always thinks the world is a lock that wants their key. And the Isles? Kavrine asked. Soria's eyes moved to the small window where the lamp's light trembled against glass. The Isles are a boundary, she said, echoing Sennic without knowing it. They keep the hungry from becoming kings over everyone else. They move because they refuse to be owned. Kavrine leaned forward. How do you survive near them, then? Soria's gaze returned to her, steady as the lamp. By not trying to win, she said. By not trying to make them small. By making your promises match your hands. Kavrine felt the words land like a stone dropped into deep water. Make your promises match your hands. Someone told you that, Kavrine said softly. Soria shrugged. The sea tells everyone. Most people don't listen until it hurts. Kavrine's mind flicked to Sennic, to the cracked salt lines on his hands, to the way he'd held himself at a distance as if closeness might turn him brittle. Tell me about Captain Varo, Kavrine said before she could reconsider. Maydrine's head snapped up from where she was helping Tamer sip broth. Rel looked up too, as if the name itself had weight. Soria's expression didn't change much, but something in her eyes cooled. So you found him. I need him, Kavrine said, then hated how the words sounded like dependence rather than fact. He knows things. He knows pain, Soria corrected. And he knows how to speak like a man trying to outrun what he did. Kavrine's throat tightened. What did he do, exactly? Soria set her cup down with a deliberate clink. Years ago, she said, a captain came through here with eyes too hungry and hands too steady. He asked me for a chart of the outer shoals, the sort I keep for rescues. I told him no, because rescue charts are not trade goods. He smiled like a man who'd never heard no from anyone that mattered, and he left. Soria's gaze held Kavrine's, unblinking. A season later, men began anchoring too close to the isles. They had partial routes. Half-truths. Enough to make them brave. Enough to get them killed. A broker from the city sold those half-truths like they were salvation. Kavrine's stomach sank. Eldrick Vaughan. Soria's brow lifted a fraction. You've heard the name. I have, Kavrine said, voice dull. The outline she'd built of Sennic's past tightened into sharper edges. So Sennic sold routes to Vaughan. Soria's mouth tightened. He sold certainty. Even if it was only partial. Even if he told himself it was harmless. The sea doesn't care about excuses. Maydrine swore quietly, anger flaring. Rel looked as if he might be sick. Kavrine's hands went cold around her teacup. Her mind tried to defend Sennic, absurdly, because she had begun to know the shape of him now, the steadiness beneath his harshness. But the truth was a blade, he had helped start this cycle of deaths. Why is he cursed? Kavrine asked, voice tight. Soria's eyes softened, just barely. Because he made a vow to the Isles, she said. And then he broke it. Kavrine stared at her. How do you know that? Soria looked away toward the lamp. Because he came back here afterward, she said, quieter. Not hungry then. Hollow. He couldn't step on my dock without salt blooming along his boots. He asked me if curses ever lift. And what did you tell him? Kavrine whispered. Soria's gaze returned, steady and unkind in the way truth often was. I told him that the sea doesn't lift curses because someone cries. It lifts them when someone becomes what they promised they would be. Kavrine's chest tightened until breathing felt like work. Maydrine leaned in, voice low. Kavrine. I know, Kavrine said, and her voice came out strained. She didn't know what she meant. That she knew Sennic's past. That she knew she should have guessed. That she knew she had begun to trust him anyway. Soria watched her. Be careful, she said. A cursed man can be honest, but honesty isn't always enough. Some truths are sharp. They cut the hands that hold them. Kavrine swallowed. I can handle sharp truths. Soria's eyes flicked briefly to Kavrine's satchel, to the vellum she carried like a second skin. Can you handle a sharp truth about yourself? She asked. About what you want. Kavrine's mouth opened, then closed. Because she didn't want to say it aloud. Want gave the sea something to test. Soria leaned back. You can stay the night, she said, brisk again. The weather is turning. And the Isles don't like it when tired people pretend they're fine. They stayed. That night, with Tamer asleep in a bunk under Soria's roof and Ferris breathing more evenly, Kavrine stepped outside onto the lighthouse's narrow landing. Wind tugged at her coat. The sea below was dark, the lamp's beam sweeping across it in steady arcs. Far out, two ships lay like shadows, Velwood and Sableward anchored at a respectful distance, lines set to sea anchors rather than stone. Kavrine watched the lamp's light slide over waves and felt the weight of the day settle into her bones. Footsteps sounded behind her. Sennic. He stood a careful distance away, as if the lighthouse's stone itself was a temptation. His boots remained on the wooden slats of the landing, not the stone step beyond. The line was invisible, but he honored it like a boundary carved into his skin. You spoke with Soria, he said. Kavrine didn't turn yet. I did. She told you, he said, and his voice was flat in a way that wasn't calm. Yes, Kavrine answered. Silence stretched, filled by the sea's low hush and the lamp's soft mechanical click as it turned. At last, Kavrine turned to face him. In the lamp's spill, she could see the salt dusting his boots, the pail cracking along his fingers where the curse had made itself known. His eyes held no plea, only readiness to be judged. You sold roots, Kavrine said quietly. Yes. You made the Isles worse. Yes. And people died because of it. Sennic's throat worked. Yes. Kavrine's hands curled into fists inside her sleeves. Anger rose, not hot, but cold and clean. Why didn't you tell me? Because you wouldn't have come, he said, and the honesty of it struck like a wave. Or you would have come with a blade instead of a compass. Either way, you would have seen me as a warning, not a guide. Aren't you a warning? Kavrine snapped. Sennic's eyes flashed, pain sharpening them. I am, he said. I've been a warning for years. It hasn't stopped people from dying. Kavrine's breath shook. Then why should I trust you now? Sennic's gaze held hers, unflinching. Because I didn't ask you to trust me, he said. I asked you to vow the truth. I asked you to draw what the Isles will allow. I asked you to do what I failed to do. Kavrine swallowed hard. You asked because you can't, she whispered. Sennic's jaw tightened. I asked because I don't deserve to be the one who writes the last line, he said. But I can help you get there. Kavrine stared at him, heart pounding. Part of her wanted to shove him away, push him into the sea and let salt and wave decide his fate. Another part of her, more dangerous, wanted to step closer, to put a hand on his cracked knuckles and tell him that people were more than their worst act. Soria's warning echoed, some truths are sharp. They cut the hands that hold them. Kavrine's voice went quiet. Do you want the curse lifted? Sennic's eyes flicked toward the stone step he would not touch. I want it to stop being a reason other people pay, he said. If it lifts, fine. If it doesn't, I will still steer away from lies. Kavrine studied him, searching for hunger. For the bright desperation Maridine had warned about. She found only exhaustion and a stubborn kind of resolve. How did you survive the Isles long enough to betray them? She asked. A humorless curve touched Sennic's mouth. I was good at listening, he said. Even then, I just didn't listen to my own vows. Kavrine's chest tightened. I need to understand the mechanism, she said. Not as myth. As rule. Sennic nodded once, as if relieved to be asked something he could answer without bleeding. The tidewrit is not random, he said. It reacts to intent the way fire reacts to oil. When you come to take, it flares. When you come to rescue, it steadies. And if you come to measure? Kavrine asked. Sennic's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. It watches, he said. It tests whether your measuring is the beginning of taking. Kavrine looked out over the sea. The registry will keep coming, she said. Pell won't stop. No, Sennic agreed. He will bring more men. More ropes. More chains. More certainty. Kavrine's fingers tightened around her coat's edge. Then my map can't be a route. It can't be a prize. Sennic watched her, as if listening not only to her words but to what lay beneath them. Kavrine turned back to him, voice steadying. It has to be something that refuses conquest, she said. Something that teaches people how to move without claiming. Sennic's gaze sharpened with a kind of fierce respect. A covenant, he said softly. Kavrine felt the word settle into place as if it had been waiting there all along. Covenant. Not a signature. Not ownership. A responsibility. She swallowed. How do I bind it? She asked, and her voice was lower now, like admitting a truth she'd been avoiding. Sennic's eyes flicked to her hands, ink-stained even now. With a vow, he said. Not just spoken. Written. The sea reads ink. Kavrine's pulse quickened. Vow ink, she murmured, recalling her own growing theories, the way the wind had shifted when she swore. Dawn water. Salt distillate. Cutter ink. Sennic's brow rose slightly. You already know. I suspect, Kavrine corrected, and a faint, strained smile touched her mouth. I need proof. You'll get it, Sennic said. For a moment, the distance between them felt smaller not because he stepped closer, but because something in Kavrine's chest unclenched. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But clarity. She could hate what he had done and still use what he knew. She could hold him accountable and still believe he was trying to become what he promised. Soria's lamp swept across them, light briefly catching Sennic's face. In that instant, Kavrine saw how tightly he held himself, as if expecting rejection to strike like a blow. Impulsively, without thinking through the risk, Kavrine reached out and wrapped her gloved hand around his fingers. Sennic went still. His breath caught. His gaze dropped to their joined hands as if he couldn't understand the sight. Kavrine's voice was quiet. "I don't absolve you," she said. "But I see what you're doing now." Sennic's throat worked. "And what am I doing?" he whispered. "Choosing the harder truth," Kavrine said. Over and over. The wind shifted again, soft, cool, like a page turning. Sennic's fingers tightened around hers, careful, as if he feared breaking something fragile. "Kavrine," he said, and her name sounded different in his mouth now, less like a warning, more like an anchor he wasn't allowed to drop. Kavrine let the contact last only a moment before she released him. The intimacy of it made her pulse race, and she didn't trust herself not to step too far into hope. "Tomorrow," she said briskly, turning back toward the lighthouse door, "we gather what we need for Dawnwater. We return to the Isles before Pell can bring reinforcements." Sennic's voice followed her, roughened. "He'll come anyway. Let him," Kavrine said. She looked back over her shoulder once. "The sea doesn't reward control. It rewards alignment." Sennic watched her, and in the lamp's glow his eyes looked less like storm glass and more like something human, tired, wary, and almost, dangerously, hopeful. The next day began with wind. Not a gale, but a steady pressure that made Soria's lamp beam tremble slightly as it swept. The sea was restless again, as if yesterday's intrusion had left it raw. Kavrine took that as confirmation. The tide writ remembered. They left the lighthouse near midday with Ferris and Tamer safely in Soria's care. The child clung to Kavrine's sleeve at the dock, eyes wide and solemn. "Will you come back?" Tamer whispered. Kavrine crouched, meeting the child's gaze. "Yes," she said. "And you'll be here, warm, when I do." Tamer's mouth trembled. "Don't let the water eat you." Kavrine smoothed the child's hair. "I won't feed it lies," she promised. Tamer nodded, as if that made sense, and let go. They sailed hard toward the Isles, the Velwood and Sableward moving like two thoughts in parallel. Kavrine spent the afternoon on deck with Rel, teaching him how to separate panic feelings from measured observations. It wasn't that his fear was useless, fear noticed things, but it could not be allowed to write the map. At dusk, the Isles appeared again, altered. The reef ring had widened, its teeth less jagged, as if it was waiting. Kavrine felt the weight of their presence in the air, a pressure behind her eyes. "That's the Heartward Drift," Sennic called across the water. "It's inviting you." Madrine's mouth tightened. "Inviting us to die. Inviting you to prove what you are," Sennic answered. Kavrine didn't like being tested by a sea. But she liked the idea of innocent sailors being tested even less. They moved into the outer lanes carefully. No anchors. No knots to stone. No shouted claims. Kavrine set new dawn stakes, farther in, risking closer proximity to the reef ring. Rel helped with shaking hands, and Madrine watched him like a hawk, ready to grab him if fear made him clumsy. The night deepened. And then the storm came not from the sky, but from the water. It began as a low moan, a vibration through the hull that made Kavrine's teeth ache. The sea around the reef ring darkened further, and foam rose in sudden white lines, scribbling chaos across the surface. Madrine swore. "That's not weather." "No," Sennic called, and his voice was harsh. "That's backlash." Kavrine's blood went cold. "From what?" Sennic's head snapped toward the west, toward the direction of Lyras. "Pell," he shouted. His naming again. Claiming again. Even from a distance. His sending intent like a spear. As if in response, the water surged. A wall of foam rose near the Velwood's stern, not tall enough to capsize but strong enough to shove. The ship lurched, ropes snapping taut, lanterns swinging wildly. Rel cried out and stumbled, his notebook flying from his hands. Kavrine lunged, catching his sleeve, but the deck heaved again and Rel was wrenched free. He slammed into the rail and pitched over, fingers scraping uselessly at wet wood. Time narrowed to a single horrifying line. "Rel!" Madrine roared, already sprinting. Kavrine's heart seized. She ran too, but she was a half step behind, her boots slipping on spray. Rel hit the water with a splash that vanished instantly into black foam. He surfaced once, eyes wild, mouth open in a soundless gasp before a current yanked him sideways toward the reef's teeth. Kavrine's stomach dropped into emptiness. She grabbed a rope and threw it, but the line fell short, swallowed by the churning water. Too far. Maritime shouted, voice cracking with fury. Kavrine's mind raced, searching for a measure, a method, a rule. The tide writ punishes claims. It rewards rescue. Rescue. She turned sharply toward the gap between ships. Sennic. The sable ward was closer to the reef ring, positioned with a precision that now made sense. Sennic was already moving, barking orders. A skiff was being lowered, fast, dangerous. Maritime grabbed Kavrine's arm. He can't. I know, Kavrine snapped, eyes fixed on the line of stone and foam. But he will. Sennic dropped into the skiff before it fully touched water, landing with the sure-footedness of a man who belonged to waves. 2 crewmen followed. The skiff shot forward under oar, cutting into churning foam that looked eager to swallow it. Kavrine's breath held painfully in her chest. Rel surfaced again, farther now, dragged near a jagged outcropping where stone was beginning to lift. His hands flailed, catching briefly on a floating piece of debris. Sennic's skiff reached him just as the current tried to slam him into rock. One of Sennic's men hooked a gaff beneath Rel's arm and hauled. The reef surged higher. Sennic shoved the skiff's bow away with an oar, teeth clenched, eyes hard. For a split second, the skiff's side scraped stone. Kavrine saw it, saw the oar's blade strike rock, saw the splash of white where salt bloom might begin. Sennic's face tightened in pain that wasn't physical alone. Then he wrenched the skiff free and drove it back toward open water with furious, desperate strength. Kavrine didn't realize she was shouting until her throat burned. Row! Row! The skiff reached the Velwood's side. Maritime and Jorv hauled Rel aboard, coughing and sobbing water. Rel lay on the deck, shaking violently, his eyes huge. Sennic didn't climb aboard. He stayed in the skiff, hands gripping the rope, chest heaving, gaze fixed on the Velwood's deck as if he was measuring how close he could come without the sea or the curse claiming him. Kavrine crouched beside Rel briefly, pressing a hand to his shoulder. Breathe, she ordered softly. You're here. You're alive. Rel's eyes latched onto hers. It pulled, he rasped. Like it wanted me. It wanted your fear, Kavrine said, surprising herself with the certainty. Don't give it more. Rel choked out a sob and nodded. Kavrine stood and turned toward the rail, toward Sennic. He was gripping the skiff's edge so hard his knuckles had gone pale. The wet rope line was looped around his wrist, and where it pressed into skin, salt was blooming white creeping along the tendons like frost. Kavrine's heart lurched. She leaned over the rail. Your hand, she said, voice tight. Sennic didn't look down. I touched the reef, he said, and the words came out like he was confessing to a crime. It started. Kavrine's chest tightened painfully. Let go of the rope, she said. If I let go, the current takes me into stone, he said, jaw clenched. Then it finishes. Kavrine's mind flashed, calculating angles and pull. Maritime, she barked. Bring the sea anchor line. Now. Maritime didn't ask why. She threw a coil of weighted line toward the skiff, and Kavrine caught it, hands moving with frantic precision. She looped it around a cleat wood, not stone, then tossed the other end down to Sennic's crewman. Hook it, Kavrine shouted. Tension on 3. They pulled together, the sea anchor biting into water and holding just long enough to steady the skiff away from the reef's teeth. The current still fought, but it no longer had full control. Sennic's breath shuddered out. Kavrine's eyes locked on his. Look at me, she demanded. Sennic's gaze snapped up, startled by the command. In the lantern's wild swing, his eyes looked nearly black. Salt crept along his wrist, but it hesitated just slightly, as if listening. Kavrine swallowed hard, then spoke with the same steadiness she used when drawing a line that had to be true. You chose rescue, she said. You did not claim. You did not take. You saved. Sennic's throat worked. It doesn't matter, he rasped. Stone is stone. It matters, Kavrine said, fiercer now. The sea is testing you. And you're answering with integrity. Sennic stared at her, shock and pain warring in his expression. Kavrine's voice lowered, softened by something she couldn't afford to name. I believe you, she said. Not the man you were. The man you are doing the work to become. For a heartbeat, everything stilled, the foam's frantic scribble, the decks lurching, the wind's sharp edge. The salt on Sennic's wrist stopped spreading. It didn't vanish. It didn't forgive him. It paused. Sennic's breath caught as if he felt it too. His eyes widened a fraction, and something like disbelief flickered across his face. Kavrine held his gaze, refusing to flinch away from the weight of what she had just offered. Belief was not softness. Belief was risk. The wind shifted, cooler, gentler, like a page smoothing under a careful hand. Then the sea surged again, reminding them that miracles were never given cheaply. Sennic's jaw tightened. Get your ship out, he snapped, forcing his voice back into harsh command. This backlash will worsen if Pell keeps pushing. Kavrine nodded, throat tight. We will. Sennic's eyes stayed on her a beat longer than necessary, as if he was trying to memorize the sound of someone believing in him. Then he yanked the skiff free of the Velwood's side and rowed hard back toward the Sableward, keeping to water and refusing stone. Kavrine exhaled shakily and turned to Maritime. Angle away, she ordered. Follow the stakes outward. We regroup. Maritime eyes were wide, her anger momentarily displaced by something else, respect, perhaps, or unease at what they were witnessing. Aye, she said, voice rough. They pulled back from the reef ring, the Velwood shuddering under the sea's restless pressure. The foam lines faded gradually, as if the tide-rit had made its point and was waiting to see if they learned. Below deck later, Rel lay wrapped in blankets, coughing but alive. Kavrine sat at her drafting table, hands steadying only when she put ink to vellum. She drew the reef ring not as a circle, but as a temperament, teeth when claimed, paths when approached with rescue. She noted the storm as backlash triggered by distant intent. She wrote in firm letters. Intent travels. Backlash ripples. Association costs. Then, beneath those lines, she wrote something that made her pause, quill hovering, heart thudding. A map can't be a prize. Maritime footsteps sounded behind her. You saved him, Maritime said quietly. Kavrine didn't look up. Sennic saved him. Maritime's silence stretched, then she said, and you saved Sennic. Kavrine's hand stilled. She stared at the wet line of ink until it stopped shimmering. I didn't, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Maritime leaned against the bulkhead. Kavrine, she said, using the tone she reserved for storms and stubborn friends, what are you doing? Kavrine swallowed. I'm making sure my map doesn't kill people. Maritime's eyes held hers. And the captain? Kavrine's throat tightened. She forced herself to answer honestly. I don't know what to do with him, she admitted. His both the wound and the warning. Maritime nodded once, as if that was the only sensible description. Then treat him like a wound, she said. Don't pretend it isn't there. Don't poison it with lies. Keep it clean. Kavrine let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Late that night, when the sea had calmed into a wary quiet, Sennic's skiff returned. He stayed in the water beside the Velwood again, hands on the rope, posture rigid. The salt on his wrist was still there, white and ugly, but it had not swallowed his arm. Kavrine came to the rail alone. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The night air was cold enough to sting. The isles were distant shapes now, darker against darker water, but their presence felt like pressure at the back of Kavrine's skull. Finally, Sennic spoke, voice low. You shouldn't have said it. Kavrine's brows knit. Said what? His eyes lifted to hers. That you believe me. Kavrine's throat tightened. Was it untrue? Sennic's jaw flexed. It was dangerous, he said. Belief is a kind of vow. The sea hears it. Kavrine leaned over the rail, meeting his gaze with stubborn steadiness. Then let it hear, she said. Sennic stared at her as if she had offered him land itself. Kavrine's voice softened, careful. I won't excuse what you did, she said. But I saw what you chose tonight. You could have stayed safe. You didn't. Sennic's breath shuddered out. I couldn't watch him die, he admitted, and the confession sounded like it hurt. Not again. Kavrine's chest tightened. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small bundle, clean cloth, oiled lightly. Your wrist, she said. Sennic's gaze flicked to it, then back to her face, wary. It won't help. I'm not curing you with cloth, Kavrine said, and a faint, tired humor touched her mouth. I'm keeping you from cracking. Sennic hesitated, then extended his arm just enough that Kavrine could reach without him touching the ship's planks. The salt crusted along his skin like frostbite. Kavrine wrapped the cloth gently, fingers careful. The closeness made her pulse jump. She kept her hands steady anyway. Sennic watched her, eyes shadowed. Why? He whispered. Kavrine's throat tightened. The honest answer was too large to fit safely in the night. So she gave the truest piece she could. Because you're still here, she said. Because you're trying. Because I'm not willing to let punishment be the only story that gets written. Sennic's eyes closed briefly, as if he couldn't bear the sound. When he opened them, his gaze was fixed on her with a fierce, restrained intensity. Kavrine, he said, and her name sounded like a vow he didn't dare speak. Kavrine swallowed, then forced herself back into the shape of work. Pell will come again, she said, voice steadying. He'll bring more ships. More claims. Sennic nodded once, grim. Yes. Kavrine's fingers tightened on the rail. Then we finish the map differently, she said. Not as a route. As a covenant. Sennic's gaze sharpened. You're committing. I have to, Kavrine said. If the tide writ reads ink, then ink must carry responsibility. Sennic's voice dropped lower, rougher. A vow-bound chart, he murmured. If you do it wrong. I know, Kavrine interrupted. If I do it wrong, it becomes a weapon. Sennic's eyes held hers. And if you do it right. Kavrine's breath caught. She thought of Tamer's small voice. Don't let the water eat you. She thought of Rel coughing seawater onto her deck. She thought of the trapped cutter scraping reef, men shouting in fear. She thought of Sennic's wrist, salt halted by a moment of earned belief. If I do it right, she said softly, it saves lives and refuses conquest. And it might, she stopped, because hope was dangerous. Sennic's gaze didn't waver. It might let me step onto shore, he finished quietly. Kavrine swallowed hard. Sennic's voice went even softer, as if speaking to the sea itself. Don't do it for me, he said. Do it because it's true. Kavrine nodded once, throat tight. I will, she promised. And as the Velwood rocked gently under a calmer night, Kavrine felt the shape of the story change. Not toward safety. Toward commitment. Toward the point where her ink would have to become more than a record, where it would have to become a vow that could withstand sunrise, the sea, the registry, and her own fear. Somewhere out in the dark, beyond the reach of the lighthouse's steady beam, the shifting isles waited, moving at dawn, erasing roads, testing hands and hearts alike. And Kavrine, for the first time, wanted something fixed enough to hold on to. Not a route. A promise. Wind came from the west for 2 days straight, pressing against the Velwood's sails like a hand trying to shove them back toward the safety of familiar waters. Maedrine took it as an insult and trimmed canvas with stubborn precision. Rel took it as an omen and wrote until his fingers cramped. Kavrine took it as information. The sea was still upset. It didn't show its anger as waves. It showed it as insistence, currents tugging at the keel when they should have flowed clean, fog that gathered in strips like bandages over wounds, and a strange metallic taste in the air that came and went whenever the isles shifted at dawn. The tide writ remembered Pell's approach, and it remembered Kavrine's refusal to turn back. It held both in its dark, moving mind. Kavrine worked below deck at her drafting table, vellum weighted and edges curled despite her precautions. She had begun a master chart, not a roadmap, but a behavior map, zones of backlash, rhythms of drift, warnings written in blunt hand. The more she treated the isles as a law rather than a prize, the more the page held its shape. Ink dried cleaner. Lines smudged less. Notes remained legible after damp nights that would have ruined ordinary paper. Even so, The chart felt like a living thing she was responsible for. It carried consequence in every stroke. Mayrine ducked into the cabin with a coil of rope over her shoulder and a scowl on her face. "We have a visitor," she said. Kavrine didn't look up. "If it's another gull, tell it to go bother a merchant." Mayrine's scowl deepened. "Not a gull. A cutter. Fast. Too clean. Coming from shore." Kavrine's quill paused in midair. Rel, perched on a crate with his notebook open, went pale. "The registry," he whispered. Kavrine set the quill down carefully, because control mattered most when fear tried to make hands clumsy. She stood and moved up the steps, heart beating hard enough to make her ribs ache. On deck, the horizon held a grey shape cutting toward them with arrogant confidence. Its sails were reefed tightly, its bow low, its line straight as a ruler drawn by a man who believed the sea existed to obey. Mayrine leaned on the rail, jaw clenched. "He found us." Sennic's sable ward was already shifting position nearby, its darker sails tightening. Kavrine saw Sennic on the quarterdeck, posture rigid, gaze fixed on the approaching cutter like a man watching a past mistake sail toward him. The cutter drew close enough that Kavrine could make out figures on its deck, Marines in registry grey, a man in a long coat standing at the bow with a hand lifted in command. Odrin Pell. Even at this distance, his presence felt like paperwork made flesh. A horn sounded. The cutter's voicebox, an amplified speaking tube, carried his words across the water, polished and sharp. "Cartographer Elowen, by authority of the Maritime Registry, you are to heave to and surrender your drafts for evaluation." Mayrine barked a laugh without humor. "Evaluation." Kavrine stepped to the rail, keeping her voice steady. "I am not obstructing," she called back. "I am surveying. You have no right to seize my work." Pell's smile was visible even from here, thin, confident. "Your work impacts crown trade and sailor safety. Oversight is not optional." Kavrine's hands curled on the rail. "Then send a clerk to my office when I return to port." Pell's gaze moved over the velwood, lingering on the crew, on the rigging, on the very shape of the ship as if he was measuring how much force he would need to take it. "You are far from port, Master Cartographer," he called. "And you have found something worth hiding." Kavrine felt the sea tighten beneath them. The isles were distant today, their silhouettes low on the eastern edge, but their presence sat in the air like pressure. The Tiderit listened. Pell raised a hand. The cutter's marines shifted, oars poised, as if ready to board. Sennic's voice cut across the gap from the sable ward, rough and clear. "Don't." Pell's head turned slightly, as if hearing an inconvenient sound. "Captain Varo," he called, and there was satisfaction in his tone. "Still afloat. Still refusing land. Still pretending you're useful." Sennic didn't flinch. "You're too close," he warned. "Your intent is loud." Pell's smile widened. "Is that what we call treason now? Loud intent?" The sea answered with a low groan, a vibration through wood that made Kavrine's teeth ache. Maydrine's eyes narrowed. "His provoking them. His claiming," Rel whispered, voice trembling. "His naming it like he owns it." Kavrine felt it too, the way Pell's straight-line certainty pulled at the water like a hook. Foam began to gather along a reef line that hadn't been visible moments before. But Pell didn't care. Or he believed, arrogantly, that backlash was something that happened to other people. He lifted his speaking tube again. "Heave to," he repeated. "Or I will take your ship under registry authority." Kavrine's mind raced. If she ran, she risked turning her path into a road. If she stopped, she handed him her work. If she fought, the sea would punish the conflict and everyone would pay. She forced herself to breathe. Truth. Not theatrics. She called back, "I will not surrender my drafts. I will share my findings when I have something that does not kill people." Pell's eyes flashed. His voice sharpened. "Then you are willfully endangering lives by withholding safe passage." Safe passage. The phrase was a claim wrapped in virtue. The sea shuddered as if offended by the lie. A reef tooth lifted ahead of the cutter, sharp, pale, wet. For a heartbeat, Pell's composure faltered. Then he recovered, colder. He motioned to his helmsman. The cutter surged forward anyway, angling not toward the reef but toward the Velwood's stern, attempting to come alongside for a boarding. Maritime snarled. He's going to ram us. Not if we move first, Kavrine snapped. She turned to Maritime. Feather the sails. Let him overshoot. Then cut across his wake. Maritime didn't hesitate. She barked orders. The Velwood's sails loosened, the ship slowing just enough to make Pell's cutter commit. The cutter lunged close, too close. Kavrine saw Pell's face clearly now, neat hair, pale eyes, a mouth shaped for signing orders that hurt people. Behind him stood a second man, dressed less formally but more expensively, wearing a dark coat lined with silver thread. His gaze swept the Velwood with a broker's hunger. Eldrick Vaughan. Kavrine's stomach dropped. Vaughan leaned toward Pell and spoke into his ear, and Pell's expression tightened into something sharper than authority. Something personal. The cutter's marines hooked grapnels toward the Velwood's rail. The sea groaned again. Kavrine's blood went cold. A boarding fight this near unsettled waters, this close to a listening tide-rit, would turn the sea into a mouth. Maritime, Kavrine hissed. No blades. Maritime looked like she wanted to bite through her own tongue, but she nodded once. Hands and rope, she snapped to the crew. No steel. The first grapnel caught the rail. A marine began to haul. Then the reef tooth ahead of the cutter rose higher. The cutter's bow scraped stone with a scream of wood and iron. Men shouted. The line between the two ships went taut, jerking the Velwood sideways. Kavrine grabbed the rail, feet slipping. Spray hit her face cold as betrayal. Pell shouted orders, furious now, and Vaughan actually laughed at the chaos, his eyes bright with excitement as if disaster was merely a price of doing business. Cut the line. Maritime roared, reaching for an axe. Kavrine grabbed her wrist. No steel, she hissed. Maritime's eyes blazed. Then how? Untie. Kavrine snapped. Hands. Jaw and Nething surged forward, fingers working furiously at knots and hooks. The grapnel's rope was thick, wet, stubborn. The cutter tugged, trapped against reef, and the tension threatened to tear the Velwood's rail free. The sea churned like it was waking. Sennic's sableward shifted, sails snapping as he angled toward them, close enough now that Kavrine could hear him shouting orders to his crew. He didn't come alongside, he hovered at the only distance the Isles seemed to tolerate, reading currents like muscle memory. Sennic called across, voice harsh. Drop your sea anchor. Let the tide take you away from them. Maritime bared her teeth. If we drop anchor. Sea anchor, Sennic barked. Not stone. Let it drag. Let it look like surrender. Kavrine understood. A sea anchor was not a claim, it was a float. It moved with the water. It promised nothing fixed. Do it. Kavrine shouted. Maritime spun and threw the order. The weighted sea anchor went overboard, line unspooling fast. The Velwood's stern tugged, the ship beginning to slide sideways with the current instead of fighting it. The grapnel rope went slack for a fraction. Nething seized the chance and ripped the hook free, hands raw and bleeding. The cutter lurched, now unbalanced without the Velwood's counterpull. Its hull scraped the reef again, trapped harder. Pell's face twisted with rage. He shouted, after them. Vaughan's voice carried, smooth, eager. Not yet. Not yet, look at the drift. The map, Pell. She's built herself a path. Kavrine's stomach clenched. Vaughan was watching her like a man watching a lock being picked. The sea anchor dragged. The tide-rit pulled them away from the cutter, away from the reef teeth, into darker water that felt unnervingly calm. Behind them, Pell's cutter remained stuck, crews scrambling. For a moment, Kavrine allowed herself to breathe. Then a cold realization struck, the cutter was only the first pressure. Vaughan was here now, and Vaughan didn't need to win a fight at sea to steal what he wanted. He needed only an opening. That night, they sailed farther from the Isles than Kavrine wanted, but she refused to risk staying close with Pell's cutter damaged and angry somewhere behind them. The sea's mood was volatile, it didn't take much to turn it murderous. They kept lanterns low. They set watches in pairs. Maritime prowled the deck like a guard dog, muttering threats to anyone who drifted too near the rail with sleepy feet. Kavrine sat below with her vellum, rewriting sections with sharper clarity, tightening her notes the way a sailor tightened knots before a storm. Rel sat nearby, pale but steady. He had stopped flinching at every creak. Instead, he watched the ink like it was a lifeline. "He's going to come again," he said softly. "Yes," Kavrine replied. "And that man, Vaughn," Rel whispered. "He looked at your chart like he could taste it." Kavrine's jaw tightened. "That's what he does. He turns knowledge into leverage." Rel swallowed. "What do we do?" Kavrine stared at the vellum. The map could not be stolen if it could not be used. The map could not become a weapon if it refused conquest. But refusal required binding, not merely intention. Kavrine's thoughts turned to dawn water, the delicate, dangerous substance gathered at the moment first light touched sea. She had not collected enough yet. She had hesitated, unwilling to court storms. Now hesitation felt like luxury. She lifted her gaze to Maritime. "At first light, we gather dawn water," she said. Maritaime's brows rose. "Out here? With Pell prowling?" "With Pell prowling," Kavrine agreed. "Because I can't wait until he gives me permission to do my work." Maritaime's mouth twisted into a grin. "That's the spirit." Kavrine didn't grin back. Her stomach was already tight with the knowledge of what dawn water required, moving close to the isle's boundary at dawn, letting the tide-writ read their intent, and asking, without words, for something that could bind ink. "You don't take. You receive." That was a different kind of courage. They approached the isles in the hour before sunrise, the sea strangely smooth again, as if it had not decided whether to welcome them or swallow them. The archipelago was reconfigured, low shapes scattered like a broken necklace. The reef ring was visible as pale scratches under the surface. Kavrine stood at the bow with a stoppered glass vessel in her hands, its neck wrapped in cloth to keep it warm and prevent cracking. Her gloves were dry. Her breath fogged in the cold. Rel stood beside her, notebook tucked away for once. His hands shook, but he kept them hidden under his sleeves. Maritime hovered nearby, eyes scanning the dark for any sign of sails. Sennic's sable ward held position off their port side, close enough to speak, far enough to avoid the isle's harshest pull. Sennic's voice carried low over the water. "Don't rush. Let the light touch first. Let it choose you." Kavrine swallowed and nodded, though her throat was too tight to answer. The horizon paled. First light slid across the sea like a blade drawn slowly from a sheath. Kavrine leaned forward, lowering the glass vessel toward the surface, careful not to splash. The moment the first sunbeam struck the water and turned it from black to bruised silver, she dipped the vessel's lip and let it fill. The water felt different, colder, heavier, almost humming. A shiver went through the Velwood's hull, subtle but distinct, as if the isles had become aware of a hand reaching. Kavrine froze. She didn't pull the vessel away. She didn't force it deeper. She simply held it steady, breathing slowly, letting her intent be what it was, not theft, not conquest, stewardship. The hum in the water eased. The glass filled. Kavrine lifted it carefully, stopper ready, fingers precise. She sealed it with wax and cloth, heart pounding. Maritime exhaled a quiet curse. "We got it." Rel's eyes were wide, his fear almost reverent. "It let us," he whispered. "It allowed us," Sennic corrected across the water, voice rough. "Don't forget the difference." Kavrine held the vessel against her chest like a fragile promise. Then a shout came from the stern. "Sails!" Maritime spun. Kavrine's blood went cold. A cutter, grey, clean, slid toward them from the west, its sails tight. Not the damaged one from yesterday. Another. Pell had brought reinforcements. And Vaughn would be with him. Kavrine's mind snapped into motion. "Maritime, turn us away. Sea anchor ready. No straight lines." Maritime barked orders. The Velwood angled, trying to slip away along the drift of the dawn stakes they'd set earlier. But the cutter was faster. It cut across their wake, attempting to bracket them between its hull and the isle's pull. Sennic's voice sharpened. "He's trying to force you into the reef ring. He wants us desperate," Maritime snarled. "He wants your map," Kavrine said, and her chest went tight with dread. Because the map was below deck. And dawn water was in her hands. And everything she needed to bind the chart was on this ship. The cutter drew close enough that Pell's voice carried without the speaking tube. "Master Cartographer," he called, almost cheerful. "How fortunate. You've done the hard part." Vaughan stood beside him, smiling like a man at a market stall. Kavrine didn't answer. She turned and ran below deck, clutching the Dawnwater vessel to her chest. The cabin was dim, lanterns swaying with the ship's movement. Her vellum lay on the table, weighted at the corners. The inked lines looked stark in the low light: warnings, behaviors, rules. Everything Vaughan would want. She grabbed the vellum and rolled it carefully, hands shaking despite her will. She slid it into a waterproof tube and tied it tight with cord. She hesitated only a heartbeat before adding the smaller field notes, pages that described backlash triggers, the kind of information that could kill if used cruelly. Footsteps pounded above. Voices rose. The sound of grapnels biting rail echoed like teeth. They were boarding. Kavrine's stomach dropped. Madrine's voice thundered from above. "Hands only. No blades." A marine shouted something crude in response. Kavrine shoved the tube into her satchel and slung it across her body. She tucked the Dawnwater inside her coat, pressing it close to keep it from chilling too quickly. Then she climbed the steps, heart hammering. On deck, chaos. 2 Marines had hauled themselves over the rail, boots thudding. Madrine and Jorv were grappling them with rope and elbows, knocking them off balance without drawing steel. Nething shoved another Marine backward with a shoulder slam, sending him stumbling into his own men. Pell stood on his cutter's deck, not boarding himself. He didn't need to get his hands dirty. Vaughan, however, had stepped onto the Velwood's rail with alarming grace, hands lifted in mock surrender, his smile bright. "Kavrine Elowen," he called, as if greeting an old acquaintance. "Still drawing with that severe little hand? Still believing paper can save people?" Kavrine's blood went cold. "Get off my ship," she said. Vaughan chuckled. "You always did mistake ownership for morality. I don't want your ship. I want your work." His gaze flicked to her satchel. "And I suspect you're carrying it." Kavrine's grip tightened on the strap, instincts screaming. Vaughan took a step closer, not threatening with a blade, threatening with confidence. "Be sensible," he said softly. "The registry can distribute your findings. Think of the lives saved. Think of the honor. You will be celebrated, compensated, elevated." "Used," Kavrine snapped. Vaughan's smile sharpened. "Directed," he corrected. "Guided. You're a cartographer, not a queen. Let the crown handle consequence." Kavrine felt the sea tighten beneath them again, responding to Vaughan's possessive tone. Foam gathered along the surface near the reef line, the isles listening, unsettled. Vaughan noticed. His eyes gleamed. "Oh," he murmured, delighted. "It reacts. How fascinating." Kavrine's stomach twisted. He was enjoying the danger. A Marine lunged toward Kavrine, hand outstretched for her satchel. Madrine saw it and barreled into him, knocking him sideways with a snarl. "Touch her and I'll feed you to the sea with my bare hands." The Marine spat and tried to regain balance. Vaughan's voice stayed smooth, coaxing. "Kavrine. If you resist, Pell will call it obstruction. He will make you the villain who endangered sailors by refusing oversight." Kavrine's pulse pounded. He was right in the most infuriating way. The registry could shape the narrative. They could frame her as selfish, dangerous, arrogant. And people would believe them because people liked simple stories. Kavrine's gaze flicked to the horizon. The isles were closer than she liked, their reef ring a pale threat under the water. If this fight escalated, the tide writ would turn on everyone. She had to end it without blades. Without claims. With truth. Kavrine lifted her chin and spoke loudly enough for Pell to hear across the gap. "Odrin Pell," she called, "if you want my work, you can have it when it is complete. Not before." Pell's eyes narrowed. "Complete means when you decide. Convenient." "It means when it won't kill people," Kavrine replied. Vaughan sighed, almost pitying. "You're still clinging to that." Kavrine's voice hardened. "And you're still selling half-truths like they're mercy." Vaughan's smile faltered for the first time. "Good," Kavrine thought grimly. Let him bleed a little in public. Vaughan's eyes cooled. You can't stop this, he said softly. You can't keep knowledge from power. Power always eats first. Kavrine's hand slipped into her coat and touched the Dawnwater vessel, feeling the cold hum through glass. Power always eats first unless the sea refused to be eaten. She met Vaughan's gaze. Then I'll make my map something you can't digest, she said. Before Vaughan could answer, the sea lurched. Not a wave. A shift. The Velwood rocked violently, foam surging along the surface like scribbles gone wild. The reef line near them lifted, pale stone flashing in the dawn. The tide was reacting to the conflict, too many hands, too much claim, too much hunger. Mayrine swore and grabbed the rail. Rel stumbled, eyes huge. The Marines froze, suddenly aware that their authority meant nothing to the sea. Pell shouted, "Hold your position." The command was absurd against water that refused commands. Vaughan's eyes widened, delighted again. It's beautiful, he breathed. Kavrine's stomach turned. Beautiful. To him, danger was spectacle. Sennic's voice cut across the chaos, thunderous. Enough. The sable ward surged closer, not to board, not to claim, but to interpose, positioning itself between the cutter and the Velwood at an angle that redirected current. It was a maneuver that required knowing the sea's mood like a heartbeat. Sennic stood at his rail, face carved from grim resolve. Pell, he shouted, pull back or the sea will take you. Pell's face twisted. You don't command me, cursed sailor. No, Sennic said, voice rough. But the Isles do. Pell hesitated just a fraction, and in that hesitation, the reef lifted higher under his cutter's bow. Wood scraped stone with a scream. Men shouted in fear. Vaughan's gaze snapped to the reef, calculating. And then he moved. Fast, decisive, like a man who knew when to abandon a sinking bargain. He lunged toward Kavrine, fingers seizing her satchel strap. Give it, he hissed, all charm gone. Kavrine yanked back, but the deck lurched again. The strap jerked hard across her shoulder. Pain shot down her arm. Mayrine roared and grabbed Vaughan, trying to wrench him away, but Vaughan twisted like an eel, throwing Mayrine off balance with surprising strength. Kavrine's heart slammed against her ribs. She clutched the satchel with both hands. Vaughan's grip tightened. You don't understand what you've made, he snarled. This is a kingdom in ink. Kavrine's voice came out fierce and shaking. It's a covenant. Vaughan laughed, ugly now. Words don't stop hunger. He yanked again. The satchel strap snapped. Kavrine stumbled, nearly falling, as the weight left her shoulder. Vaughan staggered backward with the satchel in his hands, triumph flashing across his face. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to that sight. Her work, her responsibility, now in the hands of a man who would sell it like a knife. Kavrine's blood went cold. Then Sennic moved. He didn't step onto the Velwood's planks. He couldn't. But he launched himself from the Sablewood's rail into a skiff that had been kept ready at his side, landing hard, already rowing. His crew shoved the skiff forward with brutal force, aiming not for land but for the narrow gap between ships where Vaughan stood near the rail. Mayrine shouted, Sennic, don't. Sennic's face was a mask. He didn't look at the stone. He looked at the satchel. Vaughan, startled, stepped back instinctively, 1 foot landing on the Velwood's outer plank extension near the rail, the portion that jutted over water. It wasn't land. It was still ship. But it was close to the boundary where the Isles listened hardest. Sennic's skiff slammed alongside. Sennic reached up not to climb, but to seize the satchel. His hand caught the strap. Vaughan grabbed it too, knuckles white. For a split second, they were locked in a tug-of-war over the mouth of the sea. And the tide, as if offended by possession, surged. The current yanked the skiff sideways toward the reef line. Sennic's boots scraped the Velwood's plank edge as he braced. Salt bloomed instantly along his soles, white, creeping, hungry. Sennic's face twisted in pain. Kavrine's heart seized. Sennic, she screamed. Sennic's eyes snapped to hers, wild, fierce. Row, he barked at his crew, voice raw. Row. The skiff's oars bit, fighting the pull. Vaughan clung to the satchel, teeth bared. Kavrine lunged forward and grabbed Vaughn's wrist with both hands, forcing her voice into something steady despite terror. "Let go," she said, low and deadly. "You're going to kill people." Vaughn's eyes flashed. "People are always the cost," he hissed. Kavrine's stomach turned. Then she did the only thing she could that wasn't violence. She told the truth like a blade. "You're not brave," she said sharply. "You're hollow. You can't build anything. You can only take what others make and sell it until it rots." Vaughn flinched as if struck. Kavrine leaned in, voice fierce, relentless. "And you'll never own the sea," she whispered. "It knows what you are." Vaughn's gaze darted to the churning water, to the lifting reef tooth. For the first time, fear crept into his face. His fingers loosened. Sennic yanked once, hard. The satchel tore free. Vaughn stumbled backward, catching himself on the rail, breath ragged. Sennic didn't celebrate. He clutched the satchel to his chest and immediately threw himself back into the skiff as his boots began to whiten further, salt creeping up his ankles. The skiff lurched away, oars digging desperately. Kavrine's throat tightened as she watched Sennic's legs stiffen, the curse flaring from that moment of near contact with fixed boundary. Salt crawled like frostbite, hungry and fast. He couldn't make it back if it spread. Kavrine's mind snapped. Belief is a vow, the sea hears it. She ran to the rail, ignoring Madrine's shout, and leaned out as far as she dared. "Sennic," she called, voice raw. "You didn't claim it. You rescued it. You are not taking, you are returning it to truth." Sennic's head jerked up. His face was contorted with pain, jaw clenched so hard it trembled. Kavrine's voice shook, but she forced it steady, like ink drawn straight. "I believe you," she said. "I believe the man you are now. Hold to it. Hold to your vow." The wind shifted. The sea's foam lines faltered. The salt creeping up Sennic's shins slowed, stopped, trembling at the edge as if uncertain. Sennic's breath broke out of him in a ragged sound. His crew rowed like men trying to outrun fate itself, dragging him back toward the sable ward. Slowly, painfully, the skiff pulled away from the reef teeth and into water that didn't pull so hard. Pell's cutter scraped again, trapped and panicked now. Marines shouted. Pell's face was pale with fury and fear. Vaughn stood on the Velwood's deck, chest heaving, eyes blazing with humiliation and hunger. Kavrine met his gaze once, just once, and saw the promise of future retaliation there. Then she turned away, because Vaughn didn't matter more than the sea. Madrine grabbed Kavrine's arm, hauling her back from the rail. "Are you trying to fall in?" she snapped, voice shaking with anger that was mostly fear. Kavrine swallowed hard. "He's dying," she rasped. Madrine's eyes flicked to the sable ward, where Sennic's skiff had just reached the ladder. Sennic climbed back aboard without stepping on any plank but his own deck, his movements stiff, salt crusted at his boots. He collapsed briefly against the rail, chest heaving. Still alive. Still human. Madrine's grip loosened slightly. "All right," she said hoarsely. "All right." The sea began to settle, not calm, but less rabid once Pell's cutter finally backed off, pulling away with a grinding groan as men shoved oars into water and fought the reef's bite. The Isles, satisfied perhaps that the claim had been punished, lowered some of their teeth back beneath the surface. Pell retreated, but not defeated. His eyes locked on Kavrine as his cutter limped away, and the promise in his gaze was cold. "This isn't over." Kavrine stood shaking on her deck, her satchel gone and then returned, her heart still pounding. She forced her hands to stop trembling by gripping the rail until her knuckles hurt. Madrine leaned close. "We can't keep doing this," she said, voice low. "He'll keep coming. Vaughn will keep coming. They'll bring more ships. More men. And the sea will keep taking bites out of everyone." Kavrine's throat tightened. She looked at the Dawnwater vessel tucked under her coat. She looked at the satchel now in her hands again, her work, saved by a man who had nearly turned to salt for it. "We're running out of time," Rel whispered, standing behind them, face pale. "They're learning. They're adapting." "Yes," Kavrine said, voice rough. "So we stop letting them chase a prize." Madrine's brows knit. "What does that mean?" Kavrine turned toward the cabin door, toward her vellum and ink and the hum of dawnwater waiting to be used. It means I finish the map, she said. Not as a product. As a vow. Madrine's gaze sharpened. Right now? Kavrine nodded once. Before they take it. Before they force it into a weapon. Rel swallowed. But you said the final binding has to be at the heart. Kavrine's jaw tightened. Then we go to the heart, she said. Madrine stared at her as if she'd suggested walking into a lion's mouth. Kavrine. I know, Kavrine cut in. She looked at the isles, distant shapes shifting under the rising sun. But the Tidrit isn't going to stop testing us until we answer with something it recognizes. Madrine's voice went low. And what does it recognize? Kavrine's fingers tightened around the satchel strap. She thought of Tamer. Of sailors drowning because of half-truths. Of Sennic's boots whitening at the edge of a boundary he couldn't cross. Of her own vow, spoken under a wind that listened. Alignment, she said quietly. Truth that holds. That night, the Velwood and Sableward sailed deeper toward the shifting isles than they ever had before. The sea darkened as if thickening. The air grew still in unnatural pockets, then snapped into sharp gusts without warning. Foam appeared in thin lines that looked like writing half erased. Sennic did not come aboard the Velwood. He didn't need to. His voice carried across the water, guiding their approach with clipped commands. Not there, he called. That's a teeth lane. Madrine adjusted course. That's a false calm. It will flip you at dawn. They angled away. Kavrine stood at the bow with her instruments, but she used them differently now. Not to force certainty. To verify the sea's mood. To respect what could be known and leave space for what could not. The isles loomed larger as midnight approached. The reef ring glimmered faintly, as if lit by something under the water. Rel whispered, "It looks like a crown." "It is," Sennic called softly, and for once his voice held no harshness, only gravity. The central reef. The heartward circle. Where vows bind and break. Kavrine's pulse pounded. "You've been there." "Yes," Sennic answered. "Once." "And you broke your vow afterward," Kavrine said, the words tasting bitter. Sennic's reply came after a long beat. "Yes." Madrine muttered, comforting. Sennic's voice went rough again, as if he needed the harshness to survive the memory. "If you're going to bind ink, you do it there. At first light. With no lies in your mouth. Because the Tidrit will hear every hollow word." Kavrine swallowed, fingers tightening around the dawnwater vessel hidden under her coat. "And Pell?" she asked. "He'll come," Sennic said. "He'll smell the heart like blood." Kavrine looked toward the darkness behind them, toward the direction Pell would approach from. She felt the inevitability like weight. The sea around the reef ring stilled in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like waiting. Just before dawn, while the sky was still a dark bruise and the first seam of light had not yet cut the horizon, Kavrine sat below deck with her vellum spread out, her ink prepared, her hands steady through sheer force of will. Madrine stood guard at the door, arms crossed, as if she could physically block destiny. Rel sat quietly in the corner, eyes wide, notebook closed for once, as if he sensed this was beyond recording. Kavrine unstopped the dawnwater. A faint hum rose from the glass, making the lantern flame tremble. She added salt distillate, measured, deliberate, and a drop of cutterlink, watching the mixture darken into something that looked like night itself. She stirred slowly, feeling the strange resistance in the liquid, as if it didn't want to be used wrongly. Kavrine rolled her shoulders back, breath steadying. Above deck, a horn sounded. A cutter. Pell. Madrine swore softly. Kavrine closed her eyes for a heartbeat, hearing the sea outside, hearing the footsteps on deck, hearing her own pulse. Then she opened her eyes and dipped her quill into vow ink. The line she drew was steady. Not because she wasn't afraid. Because she was. And she was drawing anyway. On deck, the first light of dawn began to form, thin, sharp, unavoidable. The isles would shift again. Pell would strike again. And Kavrine had to finish what she had begun before the sea erased her chance, or before men like Vaughan turned her truth into a blade. She set the quill down, rolled the vellum with fierce care, and stood. "Now," she said, voice quiet and unwavering. We go to the heart. The sky at the edge of dawn looked like a wound opening, dark, giving way to thin, pale light that cut across the sea with merciless precision. The Velwood and the Sableward rode in uneasy proximity to the Heartward Reef ring, where the water glimmered faintly as if something below the surface held its own stolen starlight. Kavrine stood on the Velwood's deck with the master vellum secured in a waterproof tube and the small vial of Vowink cradled close beneath her coat. The ink felt heavier than it should, as though it carried not merely pigment but consequence. Her hands were steady only because she refused to let them be otherwise. Maydrine remained at her side like an embodied oath, jaw tight, eyes scanning the horizon. Rel hovered nearby, pale but upright, his notebook held shut. This was beyond recording, and he seemed to know it. From behind them came the low growl of a horn. Pell's cutter approached again, faster now, with a second boat in its wake. He had brought more hands, more rope, more certainty. Lanterns winked in the pre-light like predatory eyes. Sennic's voice carried from the Sableward, rough and urgent. Ignore them. The heart is listening. Any fight becomes a claim. Maydrine snarled softly. And if they board? We don't give them a battle, Kavrine said, voice low. We give them nothing to use. Maydrine shot her a look. That sounds like dying with principle. It sounds like keeping our vow, Kavrine replied, and the words felt like stone in her mouth. Heavy. True. The sea beneath them tightened. Foam lines appeared in thin strokes across the black water, scribbling warnings that vanished as quickly as they formed. The reef ring shimmered pale beneath the surface, teeth waiting to rise. Pell's voice boomed across the gap, amplified, smooth as polished iron. Cartographer Elowen, heave to. You are in violation of registry authority. Kavrine didn't answer him. Answering would turn him into the center of the story, and the sea was already too interested in his hunger. Instead, she focused on the Heartward ring. At first light, she had to write. Not on the isle's stone, never on stone, but on vellum held over water that touched the dawn. The tide writ red ink. It read breath. It read the gap between promise and intent. The horizon brightened. A single sunbeam broke free and touched the sea. The isles moved. The Heartward ring shifted like a crown turning on an unseen brow. Reefs rose in slow arcs, then dipped again, rearranging the water lanes into new, unfamiliar shapes. Currents tightened into spirals, pulling at hulls as if trying to decide which ships belonged and which should be swallowed. Maydrine grabbed the rail as the Velwood lurched sideways, dragged by a sudden current. Rel stumbled and caught himself, knuckles white. Sennic's Sableward adjusted its angle with practiced precision, sails snapping as it rode the shifting pull. Pell's cutter, however, tried to hold a straight line. Wood creaked under stress. Men shouted. Oars plunged into the sea as if force could out-argue law. The reef ring responded with teeth. A pale ridge rose beneath Pell's cutter's bow. Not high enough to split it, but enough to stop it. The cutter's hull scraped stone with an ugly, grinding scream. Pell shouted in fury, and the sound felt like a claim hammered into the air. The sea shuddered. Foam surged, darker water boiling near the ring. The tide writ was awake now, fully attentive, and its attention was not gentle. Kavrine. Maydrine snapped, voice strained. Now or never. Kavrine's pulse hammered. She turned toward the small skiff hanging at the Velwood's side. Lower it, she ordered. Maydrine's eyes widened. Into that? We don't go onto stone, Kavrine said tightly. We go onto water. We right above the boundary. Rel's face went ashen. You're going out there? Kavrine met his gaze. If I don't, Vaughan will sell half-truths until the sea eats everyone who believes him. Rel swallowed, throat working. Then, unexpectedly, he nodded. I'll row, he said hoarsely. Maydrine's expression softened for a heartbeat, then hardened again. I row, she corrected. You steer with your shaking hands and I'll throw you into the sea myself. Rel managed a weak, terrified smile. Aye. Kavrine shoved the waterproof tube and the ink vial into a smaller satchel she could strap tight across her chest. She tucked quills into a protected case, waxed and ready. Sennic's voice cut across the water, urgent. Kavrine, don't. Kavrine looked up. Sennic stood at the sablewood's rail, face pale in the growing dawn, boots still crusted faintly with salt from the earlier flare. His hands gripped the wood hard. I have to, Kavrine called back. Sennic's jaw clenched. If you go too close, the ring will read you. It will test you. Kavrine's throat tightened. Then I answer with truth. Sennic stared at her, and for a heartbeat the hardness in his eyes broke, showing something raw beneath. Truth isn't always enough, he said, voice rough. Not if you're alone. Kavrine swallowed and said the only honest thing she could. Then don't let me be. Sennic's breath caught. He went still. Then, slowly, he nodded once, sharp, decisive, like a man choosing to step into pain on purpose. The skiff hit the water with a slap of spray. Maritime dropped into it first, oars already in hand. Rel followed, clutching the side as if it might save him. Kavrine climbed in last, careful, the satchel strap cutting across her shoulder like a reminder of responsibility. They rowed toward the Heartward Ring. The sea felt different here, thicker, humming faintly, as if every molecule held attention. Foam lines formed and vanished beneath their oars like ink that refused to stay. Behind them, Pell's cutter scraped and shifted, still trapped, but his second boat, smaller and more maneuverable, began to angle toward Kavrine's skiff, attempting to intercept. Pell understood now, if he couldn't seize the map from the ship, he could seize the writer from the water. Kavrine, Maritime hissed, glancing back. They're coming. I know, Kavrine said. She forced her gaze forward. Keep rowing. No straight lines. Follow the foam. Maritime rowed in small arcs, letting the skiff drift where the tide seemed least offended. It felt like moving through a living maze that changed whenever you tried to define it. The Heartward Ring rose ahead of them, stone just beneath the surface, pale and gleaming. In its center the water was darker, almost mirror-smooth, as if it was holding a secret it didn't want touched. Kavrine's breath hitched. This was where vows bound and broke. She pulled the vellum from its tube with careful hands, the edges curling as if eager to escape. She laid it across a small wooden board Maritime had brought, floating, not fixed, and weighted the corners with smooth sea stones that had never touched land. No claims. Only balance. Kavrine unstopped the ink. The hum rose stronger now, and the air tasted of salt and iron and something like dawn. She dipped her quill. The first stroke she drew was not a route. It was a boundary note, a warning written in firm hand. The isles move at first light. Do not name a shore path. The letters held. They did not blur. They did not smear. Kavrine's chest tightened. The sea was listening and, for now, allowing. Maritime voice was tight. Write fast. Kavrine forced her breathing steady. Steady, she corrected. Fast is how hands lie. She drew the final elements of her chart, the behavior fields, the backlash zones, the rescue lanes that only existed when approached with humility. She wrote the rules plainly, each one a blade against conquest. Intent travels. Claims provoke teeth. Rescue steadies the water. Rel stared at the letters like he was watching a miracle. It's holding, he whispered. Kavrine's throat tightened. Because it's true. Behind them, the second boat closed in. Marines shouted. An oar splashed hard, driving them forward. Kavrine. Rel gasped. They're almost. I know, Kavrine said, and her heart hammered. The map was nearly complete. The last thing she had to add was the most dangerous. The vow. She had no room for flourish. No room for poetry. The sea didn't care about pretty words. It cared about alignment. She lowered her quill and wrote her name. Not as a signature of ownership. As a witness. Kavrine Elowen, witness. Then she paused, quill hovering, feeling the sea's attention tighten like a hand around her throat. Maritime's oars faltered. Kavrine. Kavrine inhaled, tasting brine, and spoke aloud as she wrote, letting breath and ink align. I vow this chart is for passage, rescue, and respect, she said, voice steady despite terror. It will not be used for dominion, taxation, conquest, or monopoly. Any hand that tries to wield it as a claim will find the sea refuses them. She wrote the words in vow ink, each letter careful. For passage. For rescue. For respect. Not for dominion. The sea shuddered. Foam lines surged outward in a sudden ring, like a ripple from a stone dropped into deep water. The hum rose, vibrating through the skiff's planks, through Kavrine's bones. For a heartbeat, Kavrine feared she had misstepped, feared the vow would be judged hollow. Then the water stilled. Not calm. Not gentle. Still, as if listening had turned into acceptance. The vellum stopped curling. The ink dried in a heartbeat, dark and sharp. Rel's breath left him in a shaky sound. It accepted it. Maedrine's eyes were wide, almost reverent. Holy. A shout cut through the moment. The marine boat rammed their skiff's side. The board holding the vellum jolted. One of the waiting stones slid, nearly tipping the map into the sea. Kavrine's heart seized. She lunged, catching the vellum's edge with her fingers. A marine reached for it, eyes wild with greed. Kavrine slapped his hand away, not with violence, but with fierce refusal, and yanked the board back toward her. Take her, someone shouted. Hands grabbed at Kavrine's coat. The satchel strap dug into her shoulder. The marine boat crowded them, oars tangling. Maedrine snarled and drove an elbow into a man's ribs. Rel flailed, terrified, but he shoved an oar between boats to keep them from fully locking. Kavrine clutched the map to her chest, the vellum oddly warm now, as if the vow ink had turned it into something alive. Then Pell's voice rang out from behind, furious and triumphant. Bring it here. Kavrine looked up. Pell's cutter had finally freed itself enough to drift closer, scraping, wounded, but still dangerous. Pell stood at its bow, arm outstretched like a man demanding the world kneel. And the sea answered his demand. The heartward ring rose. Stone lifted beneath the cutter in a slow, inexorable arc, tipping it sideways. Men screamed. Ropes snapped. Pell staggered, grabbing for the rail. The marine boat beside Kavrine's skiff lurched as the current shifted violently, pulled by the reef's sudden rise. The tug threatened to tear both small boats apart. Maedrine shouted, "We're going to capsize." Kavrine's mind went cold and clear. The vow was written. The map held. The sea was punishing claims. Now she had to get the map back to the ships without turning their escape into a road. She looked to the foam lines swirling around them, thin strokes, pointing in an arc away from the cutter, away from the lifted reef tooth. The foam, she gasped. Row with the foam. Maedrine didn't hesitate. She dug her oars in, following the arc, letting the current carry them rather than fighting it. The marine boat tried to follow, but their pursuit was a claim, a straight-line hunger, and the water resisted. Their oar caught a sudden pull, the boat spun, colliding with a reef point that rose like a hooked finger. Men shouted in panic. Kavrine didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. The skiff surged forward along the foam's curve, slipping through a narrow lane of calmer water that felt like a door briefly cracked open. Rel sobbed, half from terror, half from relief. It's letting us go. It's letting us pass, Kavrine corrected, breath ragged. Because we're not taking. We're leaving. They reached the Velwood side. Jorv and Nething hauled them up with frantic strength. Kavrine clambered aboard last, clutching the vellum to her chest like a beating heart. The moment her boots hit the deck, the sea's hum eased, as if the tide-writ had finished reading. Kavrine stumbled, knees nearly buckling. Maedrine grabbed her elbow, steadying her with hands that shook. Tell me you wrote it, she rasped. Kavrine managed a tight nod. It's done. Rel collapsed onto the deck, coughing, laughing, crying all at once. Across the water, Sennic's sableward held position near the heartward ring's edge, sails taut. Sennic stood at the rail, face tense, watching Pell's cutter tilt dangerously as the reef held it like a warning. Pell screamed orders. His marines scrambled, terrified now, their authority stripped naked. Vaughan stood behind Pell, gripping a mast line, his face pale. He looked not delighted now, but furious that a system existed that wouldn't be bought. Kavrine met his gaze across the water for a heartbeat. She saw hatred there, yes, but beneath it, something worse, helplessness. The sea had told him no. Kavrine turned away. Get us out, she told Maedrine, voice hoarse. Sea anchor only. Follow the foam. No straight line. Maritime barked orders. The Velwood's sails shifted. The ship began to slide away, carried by a current that felt less like a trap now and more like a stern escort. The Heartward ring lowered slowly, releasing Pell's cutter enough to keep it from breaking entirely, but not enough to let Pell regain dignity. The sea wasn't murdering him. It was humiliating him. Teaching him. And teaching everyone watching. As the ships pulled away from the Heart, the Isles continued their dawn drift. Reefs rose and fell with slow deliberation, no longer frantic. Foam lines smoothed into quieter arcs, like handwriting that had finished a sentence and set down its pen. Only when the Heartward ring was behind them did Kavrine let herself breathe properly. She went below deck with the master vellum and laid it flat on the drafting table. The vow ink had dried into a deep, matte black that did not smear when she touched it with a gloved fingertip. It held. Maydrine leaned over her shoulder, eyes narrowed. So, what happens if Pell steals it later? Kavrine's throat tightened. Then he'll discover the vow isn't a decoration, she said softly. The sea will read his intent through his use. If he tries to claim, it will mislead him. It will punish him. The map will refuse to become a road for conquest. Rel sat on a crate, still damp, staring at the vellum as if it might bite. A map that can say no, he whispered. Kavrine nodded. A map that can say no. Silence stretched. The ship creaked gently. The sea outside sounded almost ordinary. Then Sennic's voice came from above deck, tight, disbelieving. Kavrine. Kavrine's heart jumped. She rushed up the steps. On deck, Sennic stood on the Sablewood's side, close enough that his voice carried without strain. He was at the very edge of his deck, hands gripping the rail, chest heaving as if he'd been holding his breath for hours. The curse, he said, voice raw. It's. Kavrine's stomach clenched. She scanned him quickly, his boots, his hands, his wrists. The salt crusting that had clung to him for so long, faint at the edges even now, was receding. Not vanishing like a spell undone, but loosening like frost melting in morning light. Kavrine's throat tightened painfully. Sennic, he swallowed, eyes locked on the strip of coastline visible far ahead, real land, fixed and grey-green under the rising sun. The nearest beach lay in a small inlet beyond the outer shoals, a place Kavrine knew well enough to trust. Sennic's voice was almost a whisper. If I step onto it. Kavrine's chest felt too tight to contain her heart. She stepped to the Velwood's rail, hands gripping wood. Don't do it because you want it, she said, voice shaking. Do it because you've earned it. Sennic's gaze snapped to hers. The stormglass eyes were wet now, and that alone threatened to undo her. I don't know how to believe I've earned anything, he admitted, voice breaking. I only know I kept choosing the harder truth. Kavrine swallowed hard. That's what earning is, she said softly. Choosing it again when it costs. Sennic's throat worked. He nodded once, sharp and helpless. Then he did something Kavrine had not seen him do, not once since they met. He turned his ship toward land. The Sableward glided toward the inlet. The Velwood followed at a respectful distance, as if unwilling to crowd the moment. When the Sableward was close enough, a smaller boat was lowered. Sennic climbed down into it with stiff movements. His crew watched with faces caught between fear and hope. He rowed alone, each stroke deliberate, as if he was afraid the sea might change its mind if he hurried. Kavrine stood at the rail of her ship, hands clenched so tight her fingers ached. The skiff reached the shallows. Sennic stood. For a heartbeat, he hesitated, boots hovering above wet sand. Kavrine's breath stopped. Then he stepped down. Sand gave under his weight. Nothing whitened. No salt bloomed. No cracking spread. Sennic stood on land, breathing hard, staring at his own feet as if he couldn't understand the fact of them. A sound tore out of him, half laugh, half sob, and he dropped to his knees, pressing his palm into the sand like a man touching a miracle. Kavrine's vision blurred. Maydrine, beside her, muttered something thick and incoherent that might have been a prayer. Rel covered his mouth with both hands, eyes wide. Sennic lifted his head slowly. His gaze found Kavrine across the water, and in that look there was no charm, no performance, only raw, astonished gratitude and something deeper that made Kavrine's chest ache. He stood and raised a hand. Kavrine didn't think. She was already moving, ordering Maritime to lower the skiff, stepping into it before her mind could invent reasons to wait. Maritime rowed her in silence, jaw tight, eyes bright. Kavrine stepped out onto the sand. The sensation of fixed ground under her boots felt suddenly strange after days of water that refused certainty. She walked toward Sennic slowly, as if rushing might break the spell. Sennic stood still, hands at his sides, as if he didn't trust himself to reach. Kavrine stopped an arm's length away. For a moment they simply looked at each other. The morning wind tugged at Kavrine's hair. The sea behind them murmured, quieter now, like a satisfied breath. Sennic's voice was rough. "You wrote the vow." "I did," Kavrine whispered. "And it held," he said, as if he still couldn't quite believe in outcomes that weren't punishment. "It held because it was true," Kavrine replied. Sennic's throat worked. "You believed me," he said, and the words were not accusation now. They were wonder. "Even when it would have been easier to call me a monster and be done." Kavrine's chest tightened. "I believed the man you kept choosing to be," she said. "Not the man you were when you broke your vow." Sennic's eyes glistened. "I don't know what to do with that," he admitted. Kavrine's hands trembled slightly. She lifted one and pressed it gently against his salt-scarred wrist, feeling warm skin beneath the old damage. "Human. Solid. Then start with this," she said softly. "Stay." Sennic shuddered. His hand rose slowly, hesitantly, and covered hers, careful, as if he feared he might crumble and take her with him. Kavrine stepped closer, and Sennic didn't pull away. They did not kiss. They did not need to. The intimacy was in the way his fingers tightened around hers like a vow renewed without words, in the way Kavrine leaned her forehead briefly against his shoulder and felt him breathe, alive and present and unbroken. Behind them, the two ships bobbed gently in the inlet. The Sablewood's crew watched in stunned silence. The Velwood's crew stood like people who had survived a storm and were only now realizing they had. After a long moment, Sennic spoke against the wind. "What will you do with the map?" Kavrine lifted her head. The question mattered. It was the final line. "I'll deliver it," she said. "But not as a prize. As a covenant." Her voice steadied as she spoke, because this was her truest work. "Copies will go to rescue pilots, lighthouse keepers, captains who agree to the vow. The registry can have it too if they accept the terms. If they don't, the sea will teach them what it teaches everyone." Sennic's gaze shifted toward the distant horizon where Pell had retreated. "He won't accept it," he said quietly. "Then the Isles will keep moving," Kavrine replied. "And his certainty will keep breaking." Sennic's hand tightened around hers, and for once the gesture didn't feel like a man trying to hold something he couldn't keep. It felt like a man anchoring himself to a promise he intended to honor. Kavrine looked back at the sea. Far out, the shifting isles were only faint shapes now, already drifting away from this inlet as the morning brightened. They did not stop moving. They did not become tame. But they felt different. Not conquered. Not owned. Simply understood, as much as any living boundary could be understood. And in that understanding, lives would be spared. Kavrine squeezed Sennic's hand. "Come with me," she said softly. Sennic's eyes held hers. "Where?" he asked, voice trembling on the edge of disbelief. "Home," Kavrine said. "Not as a place that owns you. As a place you choose." Sennic swallowed hard, then nodded once, like a man accepting a truth he'd been afraid to name. Together, they turned toward the waiting skiff and the quiet shore beyond it, while behind them the sea murmured like ink settling on a page, holding, for once, because it had been written with a vow instead of a claim.